Merry Christmas, Tom.
Merry Christmas, my very festive friend, slightly more
Yeah,
festive.
well, if you're watching the video version of this and not the podcast, you'll
That's true, I
see
forgot, yeah.
I light up like Christmas tree, to quote a James Bond film we're not talking about today.
I always forget that podcasts maybe aren't the most visual medium.
No.
When I,
So if you're listening to the podcast, you might just want to flip over to YouTube just to see how tasteful my jumper is
it's
today.
beautiful,
Y-
genuinely.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and you're looking fairly festive.
Yeah,
You've got some Christmas action going on in the
mhm.
background, so to speak.
Well, we'll get there.
Yeah, we definitely will get there. So today we're talking about The World Is Not Enough and three iterations of the
Mm.
screenplay for The World Is Not Enough. Uh, Long-time listeners of the podcast or viewers of the YouTube channel will obviously recognize Tom's uh, gorgeous visage or his gorgeous voice from previous episodes. First of which we were talking about Diamonds Are Forever
Mm.
and the slightly, should we say, unhinged. I don't think that's overstating it. Versions of Diamonds Are Forever in the treatment stage, and then the second episode, which actually, as of time of recording, is actually the most listened to episode of the Licensed to Queer podcast, the Something Fishy episode, where we went through both the treatments and screenplays from two writers of The Spy Who Loved Me. So today it's the turn of The World Is Not Enough.
Yeah.
And I think it's fairly safe to say, just to manage expectations slightly, there is some madness in these scripts. Probably not on the scale of some of the just plain weirdly uncomfortable things that are in the Diamonds Forever and Spy Who Loved Me early treatments. But this is because we've read the screenplays rather than the treatments, and the screenplays are obviously much further along in the production process. So some of the weirdness has been ironed out. Having said that, there is still quite a lot there. And what's really interesting is how certain ideas survive all the way through and certain ideas are killed off after the first script.
Yeah.
And we're actually dealing with the work of at least four people today. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we actually will discuss one people may be less familiar with than the other
Yeah.
three.
So again, if you're watching the YouTube version, not on the podcast, you'll see I've put behind me the image from the title sequence for The World Is Not Enough, which credits three writers with the screenplay. That's Neil Purvis, Robert Wade, and Bruce Firestein.
I will say Fierstein, but it's one of those where
Fierstein.
like I've
Let's
only
go.
ever seen it written down, probably.
Yeah. And the story was Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. I think
Yeah.
that's pretty, in terms of credit where credit's due. The first draft of this screenplay does have pretty much all but one or two of the key sequences that, if things are in a different order, which we'll get to, which is quite important, but it has pretty much all the characters, most of the characters, pretty much all the scenarios. So I think it's totally legitimate for Purvis and Wade to have the story credit to themselves here. But there's actually a name missed off here, and that person is Dana Stevens, who I understand was actually the partner of the director at the
Yeah,
time.
that
They
is
divorced later on, but Michael Apted's partner, Dana Stevens, who was in her mid-30s then, and she's actually quite a renowned writer in Hollywood now. But she did the second draft before Bruce Fierstein
yeah.
approached it. And it's a bit strange. I think one of the conclusions we've both reached, Tom, is that it's a bit strange that her name isn't on the
Mhm.
title sequence. And
Absolutely, I would agree.
and I don't know the reasons why, if I'm honest. I would hope that it's not that age-old thing going back to the days of Dr. No and Johanna Harwood not being paid as much as the men, even though she probably made the biggest contribution to that screenplay. I hope it's not kind of that classic. I know there's all sorts of reasons why people's names do and don't end up on a film, but we don't really know the reason why, do we?
No, I'm honestly not aware of one that's been so publicly known. And to me, it's almost kind of particularly egregious because I know when we were first discussing this, you slightly corrected me, and I think you were right with maybe rephrasing what I said. But as you mentioned, the Purvis and Wade thing, I'd say maybe the skeleton of the film is
Yeah.
there, but you can tell in the second draft that I would say like some of the more interesting moments. I mean, all the things that we maybe associate with the film as far as some dialogue lines, some character moments and beats. were there, and it's her work maybe rather than some of the others. And so I think she's definitely the unsung hero of this whole production, personally.
I would say so. I would say that probably up to maybe about 50% of the dialogue is hers in the finished film. And the fact that she's not even credited for screenplay, I think, is a massive oversight there. I also think that she makes the film far more grown up, especially around sex. The Purvis and Wade script is quite, should we say, a bit adolescent at times in its treatment of sex, and also the way that Electra is treated. She's a much more rounded character, and we'll get into the detail of some of that in a bit. But yeah, Electra, the character, is probably the biggest change from the first to the second screenplay. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. I think what we want to do to kind of keep this coherent is we're going to go through the film in film order rather than talk about draft 1, draft 2, then draft 3. We'll go through the film in order, starting with the pre-title sequence all the way to the end and that joke. And that's the reason why Tom went with that backdrop today, because that joke, it's really interesting to see the early versions of that joke. And we have tongue-in-cheek called this episode Christmas Comes Again and Again, because there are different versions of how this film ended. I'm going to have to be really, really careful with my language here, because we are going to be talking about female pleasure and different kinds of sex acts. So if at times it sounds like I'm teaching a PSHE lesson to teenagers and I'm kind of minding my language in that sense, that's because I've only just got the MBE and I don't want it taken off me. So I'm just going to have to tread carefully today and choose the anatomical terms for everything rather than yes, some alternatives. Anyway. Anything before we start, Tom? What are you drinking today?
I've got a lovely gin martini.
A gin martini, and we are recording this in fairly early afternoon. I mean, there's no judgment passed there at all, Tom. But when you told me you were having a gin martini, I went with a G&T, but a Christmas G&T. So Merry Christmas again.
You too.
And if you are listening to this episode in March and you're thinking you're not feeling particularly festive, just remember Christmas does come more than once a year. Anyway, with that in mind, let's begin. So the pre-title sequence, Tom, what did you make of the pre-title sequence in the way it appears in the different drafts?
It's one of those interesting things where we mentioned it sort of certainly last time with The Spy Who Loved Me, but also I guess with Diamonds Are Forever, where you can see ideas from the very first draft that kind of survive until the end, but often with quite significant changes. And this is, I think, a fantastic example of it, because as you've kind of alluded to at the start, the structure of the pre-titles in the final film is there in that first draft, but a lot of it is majorly different for a whole variety of reasons that we'll touch on some of them. One of the first things that struck me was the variation in location, which I'd imagine was possibly just speculative, and then where they could end up filming and where we give them the best tax breaks, that sort of thing. And we 3 different drafts, and we've got 3 different locations, from Cuba in the first draft, Geneva in the second draft, which is when we get the Lachaise figure becomes a Swiss banker, and then they move to Bilbao in the final draft. And again, with Cuba, we've got this thing of ideas being recycled later on, because of course in the next film we have Bond in Havana, which is where they were going to shoot some of this. But there's some really interesting little moments, like stage directions, like Purvis and Wade mentioning the gun barrel being reflected in Bond's, or a gun barrel being reflected in Bond's glasses.
I love that visual idea. I hope we see that in a future Bond film.
Yeah, I mean, it did make me think of like Sam Mendes spinning in his grave a bit, because what was that comment he made about, why he didn't have the gun barrel at the start of Skyfall, because he didn't like the imagery of Bond coming center of the frame right off after the gun barrel in the first shot of Skyfall. So like to have the gun, I quite like the visual symmetry of gun barrel to a actual gun barrel.
So if I understood it correctly, we'd go from the gun barrel to as in the film, he's wearing a set of glasses.
Yeah,
The gun's so close to the lens that it's reflected in there. So it's almost like a visual match cut, isn't it?
exactly. That's how I pictured it too in my head, and it's a really I mean, this is maybe going forward a little bit, but at there's like a nice bit of visual similarity at the end of the pre-title sequence where at least in draft 2 and 3, the actual credit sequence itself was supposed to be like a very begin with a close-up of Bond's eye with the exploding balloon reflected in that, and that would go into the pre-title. So there's this sort of eye and reflection symmetry at the start and the end of the pre-title sequence, which I think is some really nice imagery. And it's as nice as I think the actual thing that we got was. I think it's a shame that some of this didn't make it into the final film. So it's some really interesting visual ideas about seeing, and of course a lot of that's some of the major themes of the film, like ideas of seeing and not stuff, things not being seen, and what Bond perceives and maybe why he perceives it wrongly, and of course with Elektra. And yeah, it's a real shame, I think, that some of this didn't make it in. But I don't know whether there's anything that particularly stood out to you.
Yeah, I mean, location-wise, it makes a lot more sense of certain things. For a start, so if you go to the second version, they're in Geneva and they're talking about Swiss banking. I know you have Swiss bank branches, I presume. I've never had a Swiss banker. I've never had reason to have to hide money, fortunately. But it would make more sense to be in Geneva for a Swiss banking scene. But then it makes even more sense to be in Cuba for the cigar girl.
Yeah.
So Cigar Girl, who's right there in the first draft by Purvis and Wade, but she's a girl who is basically rolling cigar on her thigh, rolling cigar leaves, which is, I believe, how very expensive cigars are still made. Again, I'm not a cigar rolling expert here, and I didn't see that myself when I was in Cuba last Christmas, but maybe we weren't just going to the right places. But yes, Cigar Girl is someone who's in a cigar factory. So rather than just someone who gives a cigar in a phallic shaped tube, and we'll get to that in just a moment, rather than just that. So you can kind of see where that idea, and you can almost imagine as they change location, Purvis and Wade were probably going, well, that joke makes even less sense now, or that characterization makes even less sense. Yeah. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is the way that Bond escapes the office is completely different in these versions, all three versions. So he effectively jumps down a lift shaft and used the counterweight of the lift to escape. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. And again, that's the sort of thing where I think yeah, I love the shot in the actual film, you know, the sort of the very high angle shot of him coming out the window and dropping down to the street. But again, as I was reading this, I got sort of some visual ideas of how they could have done the lift sequence, maybe of, you know, we have Bond coming down and we see the lift go up in the background full of the police officers, and they escape, you know, he dodges them that way. And I think it's again an interesting sequence that I'm surprised we haven't seen recycle. I suppose there's some similarity with the jumping out the window thing, but I like the idea of this lift counterweight sequence. Of course, calls back to some things like Diamonds Are Forever, and when you know the lift sequence, they're riding on top of the lift.
Yeah.
And
View to a Kill, the lift
exactly.
escaping the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought, just before we get to the chase, which is again is quite different, is that we get a lot more kind of filling in about what the report actually is. And I kind of see why they took all of that detail out of the film, because it would just give you too much detail. But essentially, the original point was for the report to be about weapons plans, and they'd been leaked from MI6. And Robert King bought these plans by accident, thinking he was buying tunneling equipment. So that's the reason why Robert King gets involved with MI6, because he's accidentally bought an MI6 report. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's how I.
Because in the film, we just have the personal relationship with M being the reason why MI6 is involved. And actually, if you think about it, it doesn't make much sense for MI6 to be involved in a kidnapping plot originally. I actually hadn't thought about that. And this is the thing with Bond films. You probably shouldn't contemplate the plot too much, because why would MI6 get involved in a kidnapping plot? Originally, you know, the kidnapping plot of Elektra and all of that. It just didn't make much sense. But I suppose this sort of detail about the plan of what's in the file, makes more sense. There's some more characterization of Robert King as well. He's a much greedier man in this, which sort of sets up why Elektra wanted to kill him better, I thought. So there's a moment where he says he wants to count the money himself in MI6. He doesn't trust someone else. And I can't help but think that this is also a reference to, and I can't believe I hadn't made this connection, but it's partly because I'm reading the Nicholas Shakespeare biography of Fleming at the moment. But Robert is presumably, that's a reference to Fleming's grandfather, who was the banker where the family got their riches from.
I'm not sure, but I imagine you'll probably never made that connection.
I didn't know if that was a reference or not, to be perfectly honest. Possibly, but yeah, we do get more. I mean, he's blown up pretty quickly, just as he is in the finished film. But we did get more of a sense that Robert King wasn't as squeaky clean as we thought he might be.
I would agree. I mean, I think it's the Dana Stevens draft that introduces a few of these sort of concepts. I think. I mean, we'll discuss. I know some of the interesting the fixations of Purvis and Wade have on sort of the corporate sector and the private sector. I think is really interesting slant to there.
That is a theme through their version, which gets lost almost completely by the end, but actually gets brought back in the Daniel Craig films, doesn't it? About Bond being potentially, moving into the private sector. But that's a thread that they're really interested in this version.
And a lot of that gets sort of lost by the Dana Stevens draft, but it's replaced by some of these different, or at least some of these character moments which are maybe in the Purvis and Wade draft about King and money become a little more exaggerated. And we also, that's where we get more of the personal friendship with them introduced, because in that draft, he buys the report because he's had attacks on the pipeline. He thinks it's connected with that, and then he realizes it's a nuclear thing and passes it over to M personally because they're old friends. And so it's interesting the way that sort of develops. I'm not sure which I prefer, because as we'll touch on more later, I'm sure I do like this sort of privatization aspect and the changing world, but also I do like the personal friendship between King and M, and it's something I think maybe it's there in the final film, obviously, but maybe not as strong as in this second draft, because that's something I think we see a lot of as you compare the drafts. There's less and less sort of extra stuff, and sometimes for better or worse, as you were saying about the Purvis and Wade draft. When you read that, it's very dialogue heavy and very exposition heavy, and sometimes it's nice to have some of these things explained in more detail, but it does feel like characters go on a bit,
especially as this is still the pre-titles, and both of us, I think, were quite surprised. We'd been led to believe that the pre-title sequence had been intended to end with Bond jumping out of the window in Bilbao or Geneva or Cuba, wherever we are. But actually, none of these scripts end there, do they? They all carry on, and they all end with some form of chase. But this is a massive difference between. So there are probably two really significant differences in terms of set pieces with the Purvis and Wade and the later. And this is one of them. So there's no boat chase in the original script. It's actually a jetpack chase.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I first read, I thought, this is a really interesting, it's a really cool idea. Like the jetpack is such an iconic Bond moment and gadget, only appeared so briefly in Thunderball, and it appears in so many games and figures, spin-off media. Yeah, the more I thought about it, I thought, how would this really work visually? Like, I'm not sure you get quite the same sort of visceral chase as you would between the two boats, because of course Bond's flying and cheesing a boat, and it feels like it's a lot shorter. I think it's maybe only like a page and a half. Which if you think about sort of I know it doesn't always necessarily equate particularly with action sequences, but usually they say like a page per minute with script. So it would be maybe like a minute and a half, and it's like nearly 10 minutes, I think, the boat chase that we get in the final film. And I know so many people, myself included, cite that as one of their favorite Bond moments ever, really, not just of this film, even of the Brosnan era, like ever, that boat chase. And I think not to have that would have been a real shame. Like this jetpack sequence, I think, feels like something that maybe you'd get later, like at a midpoint of a film, rather than being the big set piece. Or at least certainly replacing the scale of that one, the boat chase. So I think that was a really good change that they made. I think it was by the second draft. It was a bow, and I was just in this Purvis and Wade one. It's a
What's
nice
interesting?
callback.
What's interesting is that the London transition from Cuba, Geneva, or Bilbao happens with a shot of the Millennium Dome and then the Tate nearby. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. So the Millennium Dome was always in the film, but it didn't feature in an action sequence until the Dana Stevens second draft. And
Yeah.
this Dana Stevens second draft even has a hot air balloon. There's actually a reference to a Richard Branson like figure. So funnily enough, Richard Branson actually, of course, ends up cameoing in Bond in Casino Royale. And in the first version, sorry to keep jumping around, but hopefully this is coherent to people listening. So if we go back to the first version with the jetpack, it ends with a massive explosion, which does injure Bond. That idea is there from the start,
Yeah.
but the injury is more like something really kind of it's not even that precise. He hurts his ribs, doesn't he? And
Yeah.
he's got some like tenderness around his ribs, which is nowhere near as obviously. He doesn't injure his shoulder until the second draft by Dana Stevens. I think that was a really sensible move because obviously you got the visual of his arm being in a
Exactly.
sling at the funeral, which can be used as an alibi by Elektra later on. Yeah, so I thought that was a sensible change.
It was a much more visual idea, I think, and
Yeah,
as you something again that exactly as you said hit me with this transition. It's one of those things again that we mentioned it the last few times. This I've got a particular fascination with ideas that survive all through
yeah,
scripts and don't make the final film. I find that really interesting. I'm not sure whether they ever filmed this because it was supposed to be like a seaplane. As you said, it comes down.
yeah,
We got a shot of it flying over the Millennium Dome, then landing opposite MI6, and then Bond comes out. It's the sort of thing where I guess if you're going, if you're looking at counting the money and, shooting, or even if you get to the edit and think, something you could lose, because, I've never watched that film and thought, oh, how did Bond get from Bilbao to MI6? Well, obviously just, he traveled back to London. But as you say, I really like the visual of going over the Millennium Bridge, Millennium Dome rather, in of London. And I think it could be a really nice shot. Like, I mean, there's quite a few in this, particularly in this Purvis and Wade draft. I think they have a really nice handle for interesting visual ideas. Like there's a
yeah.
one in this pre-title sequence where the meeting between M and Bond and King is slightly different because Bond basically gets chucked out of the office while King and M stay talking, and he goes and does a bit of research on King and his background. And they mention this lovely shot of sunset out the window of MI6 over the Thames and comparing it to a Turner painting. And if you think, oh, that would have been a really lovely visual, I think.
I want
And
to
yeah,
ask if I eventually meet Purvis and Wade, I want to ask them who's the Turner fan because obviously Turner turns up in Skyfall as well. But yeah, that is a really lovely description. The Thames is afire, burning as it did in Turner's day, so that it would have been like a shot at magic hour, I suppose.
Yeah, I think they've got a real flair for visual shot suggestions. I know from reading that some directors don't like that in scripts. They like to have full control of what it's going to look like. But I always find it like personally reading a script, I like some things to latch onto when you can picture things in your mind. And they have, as I say, a real flair for some of these really interesting ideas.
Before we get stuck into the post-title sequence, there's a couple of bits. So there's a scene where Renard gets introduced in every version of these scripts, and I have a feeling, I'm sure I heard on an interview somewhere that this was actually filmed
It
between.
was.
Yeah, so it must exist somewhere as a deleted scene. I don't think it's on any of the DVD or
It
Blu-ray
is
versions.
actually, yeah.
Is it on there?
Yeah. The one in Bilbao is certainly.
Oh, right. Okay. I need to go back and rewatch the deleted scenes then. 'Cause
Yeah,
I couldn't remember.
it's
Maybe I did see it years ago and it's kind of that's
probably
where
come
I got it
across it
from.
because it's one of those things where it seems really interesting on paper, but like when I re-edited The World Is Not Enough, like I did, I know I mentioned passing, I've done this a few times and re-integrating some of the deleted scenes just because I find it a really interesting experiment to see what works and what doesn't. And I think it's something that really doesn't work, and
No.
taking there was probably a good change because of course then we get Renard introduced much later in the film and he kind of hangs over maybe almost like certainly the first act, but like the first act in a bit is like this unseen presence. And I think introducing him then, it just feels a little anticlimactic. I mean,
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
still
I
he's
agree.
sinister,
Yeah.
but the other thing actually I'll mention now while I remember before we move on past the pre-titles is you mentioned this idea of where they're originally supposed to end, and that was actually Michael Apted that introduced this idea, which I find really interesting, because I'm like, why would he lie? Why would he be unsure? I think it was on one of the commentaries. He said basically the pre-titles was supposed to end after the Bilbao sequence, and then it was in editing we realized that it was really short, and this jump out the window wasn't a good way to end the pre-titles, so why not move it after the boat chase? But as we've said, like every single one of these drafts, including the one written by his then wife, ends with it specifically says, you know, the transition of the title is after this boat chase. So I'm not sure, maybe he's getting his wires crossed, and there was at some point in editing they thought about moving the pre-titles to before the boat chase, then moved it back.
I think perhaps it might be because the boat chase ended up being a lot longer than originally envisioned. And in fact, there are deleted scenes, aren't there, of parts of the boat chase that still don't make the film, so that had to be tightened up a lot. So maybe they thought, right, the boat chase is going long during filming, so we'll put that after the title sequence. And then they decided, but as you say, definitely in the script stage, there was always a chase at this point. The other thing that I couldn't help zeroing in on is, of course, the cigar joke with Moneypenny, which I think was intended to be a reference to Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton at the time. So another contemporary reference. But this joke, like the joke that climaxes the film, so to speak, this joke it starts off as being, you know, there's a reference all the way through these scripts to it being a large phallic tube, so it was always intended to be penis shaped and make us think of that. But Moneypenny's original remark to James when he gives it to her is, "I gave up a long time ago." So we can interpret that as in any way we like. And then that actually changes by the time of the Fierstein draft. She does say, "I know exactly where to put it," which is very similar to what we get in the film, but then follows it up with, "Sure you don't want to give her," referring to M, "the cigar?" And Bond gives a slightly weird look. So yeah, I'm kind of glad we didn't get that line in the film. I'm not sure, that would have probably just made people feel uncomfortable. I don't know.
I mean, you're no doubt the more of an expert on this symbolism than I am. But the other
That's
thing
my
again,
reputation, I'm afraid, Tom.
the other thing that I found quite interesting, because I feel this is probably what's supposed to be in the final film, but I feel like I'm a bit of an idiot for never making the connection, is it's quite explicit, well, literally and metaphorically, in each of these drafts that the cigar he gives to Moneypenny is the same one the cigar girl either gives to him or rubs on her thigh or something. I find that a really interesting connotation of passing this phallic thing from this woman that he's clearly flirting with onto Moneypenny.
Well, when I eventually come around to doing the queer review of World Is Not Enough, trust me, that's going to feature a lot.
So yes, it's an interesting development of this pre-titles, but I don't know whether you'd agree with me. My personal opinion overall is I think I like what we got. I mean, there's some character moments and beats I think and dialogue sequences and that are nice, but I think largely I would say it's good changes that they made overall to the final.
I agree. Even the characterization of Robert King, it would be too much information, really. It would probably set things up later on, but the thing is with the pre-title sequence, you just want it to be this. I know it's not self-contained here, and this one is particularly not self-contained because it sets up so much for the rest of the film, but it would actually just give you too much to think about.
I agree.
And actually, it would take you out of the sheer joy of that pre-title sequence, which is, as like you, it's one of my favorites. There's just one more thing I want to say about it, and there is a line of dialogue which I know I've read in a screenplay before, and hopefully you can kind of fill me in where I've seen this before. But in the third version, the Bruce Fierstein version, M does say after Bond says, "Who buys stolen reports for £3 million?" M says, "Contrary to what you may believe, 007, the world is not populated by madmen who can hollow out volcanoes, fill them with big-breasted women, and threaten the world with nuclear annihilation," which is obviously a very reflexive meta comment on the history of Bond and some of the excesses of earlier versions. But it is familiar to me. I'm sure I've read this before.
As Bond says, it only takes one. So it's
and then Bond says it only takes one, as in one madman. Yeah. So where have I read this before?
It's a bit of a Bruce Fierstein classic because it was originally supposed to be in Tomorrow Never Dies. After that, I forget where exactly. It was still M, I believe, that delivered the line, and I forget exactly where was it? I imagine sort of. I think it was in the briefing sequence in the car, and it got cut from there. And obviously, he must have just really liked the line, so it reappeared in this. And since we were talking about deleted scenes, this was actually filmed. It's on the DVD. This extended briefing sequence, so we do get this exchange between
Oh yeah, that's it.
M and Bond. I love Brosnan's line delivery of "It only takes one" as he's like drinking the whiskey. It's great. Like if anyone hasn't seen the deleted scenes, I'm sure they're on YouTube now. I think somebody's uploaded them. That isn't me, but um, they're well worth a look because the extended briefing sequence, it does retain some of these more sort of explanatory bits of dialogue, but there are some really nice bits of character dialogue in there as well.
That's brilliant. There is another visual idea that transitions us into the title sequence, which is in the Fierstein draft. There is a close-up of an explosion reflected in Bond's eye. So for some reason, at least two versions of this were slightly obsessed with having a match cut with an explosion in Bond's eye, which is very, obviously that goes back to Goldfinger and the pre-title sequence with the villain attacking and being reflected in the lady's eye. So yeah, it's just interesting that two sets of writers thought that would be a good idea.
See, I really love that visual. As I say, it's something that I quite liked. I mean, we get some of, they were obsessed with Daniel Craig's blue eyes, I think, in the pre-tales. I'm surprised we didn't get something like that somewhere.
Yeah.
Of course, because Casino Royale always stands out to me, that one where he's basically at the end of the pre-tales, where he's basically in monochrome, except his eyes, which are really bright blue. And it would have been nice to get, again, I one of the great things, as I keep saying from doing this, is these ideas that either do get recycled or that we would like to see recycled, because there's so many. Like, just if I were lucky enough to ever write one of these things, which has never happened, but I would love to go back and mine some of these great ideas for a thing, because you could, by this point, you could probably put a film together with just from the three that we've looked at, unused ideas, and get something really good.
And there's actually loads to come as well. If you're thinking of, I mean, we have spent a long time talking about the pre-titles, but that's one of the areas of the film which is quite different from the different versions. But there are lots of things that we'll come to in a bit, which we find actually did come up in the subsequent films, including the Daniel Craig era. So let's get into the post-titles then. Yes. The first draft has a part where we think, actually, because it ends on an explosion with Bond being presumably killed in the first draft, we actually are led to believe for a few moments that we might actually be Bond's funeral. So they were playing with the idea of Bond dying nearly 25 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think really stands out to me reading this first draft, is it's obvious how much reverence Purvis and Wade have for the source material. I mean, they very much do their own thing. Like, as they often got, whether you agree with the criticisms or not, they often got knocked for in the Craig era for their deviations from it. But it's clear that they have a real reverence for what came before, both with the jetpack and things like this Bond being dead funeral thing. Again, that's like straight from Thunderball, like, is it Bond's funeral? And this idea of killing Bond off at the end of the pre-titles, is he actually dead? You could argue kind of the spy will love me until the parachute comes up. I mean, we all know he's not going to die at the end of the pre-titles, but it's an old idea. And that comes up a lot in their draft, and it's a shame a lot of that doesn't survive. Some of it is neat ideas, some of it feels a bit almost in like fan service territory, so maybe the best that's not there. But as I will mention when we get onto some of the more relevant points, I find interesting that some of the things that I personally have ascribed to Purvis and Wade of Bond history references are actually from the later drafts, and it's interesting that they didn't mention some of these things.
Yeah, there's another sequence actually added in the second version where Bond and Elektra meet at this point of the film. So they actually meet privately away from the funeral. It's almost like they both need to get some space from the funeral, which was an intriguing scene, but that was removed by the third draft. And I can kind of see why, because that first meeting of the two has to be as impactful as possible. But that was an interesting idea to have them meet earlier.
I'd agree. I mean, I same as you. I see why it was cut, and I agree that's probably the film was maybe stronger for it. But I adored this little scene, this thing.
It's really well written.
Yeah, it's really well written, and I particularly loved just this one little moment, and something I wish there was more of in the final film, because they kind of halfway go there, but not entirely. Of Bond and Electra talking, Electra gets called back, and Bond looks up, and there's like this figure standing on the hill, just Renard. I mean, we don't know it's Renard yet because, well, I suppose in this draft we would, because
Yes.
we'd have met him in Bilbao. But I was almost visualizing it as sort of similar to the final film, where we haven't seen him in Bilbao yet, and this would be the first glimpse we get of some guy just standing watching them
Yeah.
on a hill, and then Bond looks away for a split second, looks back, and he's gone. And it's like this classic like slasher movie trope of him just vanishing. I would have liked if, you know, the creepiness of Renard to get played up more, because I think it maybe comes across in these drafts more. We get the things like the Devil's Breath sequence in the final film, where he feels a bit of like almost like a supernatural character, and I do love these little moments we get. And that one really stood out to me is just this really interesting idea, and it's only in this second draft. It's not in the first one. It's gone, as you say, by the third one. It's a beautiful little moment.
Yeah. There's also a reference to Bond driving a silver DB5 rounding the hill, cutting to the hillside, and I couldn't help but think of Skyfall at that point. So this visual of the DB5 being kind of dwarfed by this Scottish glen, that was an idea that goes all the way back to The World Is Not Enough, a visual idea anyway. There was also a nice little joke at the expense of the Millennium Dome. So in the second version onwards, when which obviously Bond falls onto the Millennium Dome in that version, that's the first time. Bond M says to Bond, "Well, at least it turned out to have some purpose." So particularly for people who aren't British, there was a whole thing at the end of the Millennium around this Millennium Dome being something of a white elephant, i.e. it was a building that no one really knew what its purpose was. And of course, it's a very popular concert venue now, but it had just a strange... Did you ever go to the Millennium Dome, Tom?
Still never been. I've always wanted to go, which
You've never actually been even now? Wow.
Never been. It's one of those things where it's obviously being from the north. I mean, I'm only tend to be in London for certain reasons, you know, occasionally a holiday, but I'm there, you know, that much for research and stuff that I kind of have reasons to go, so it doesn't feel like a holiday. I've never really found the time to go out to like Greenwich area to go to the Dome, and it's just like I keep wanting to, and I'm gonna fit it in eventually. But I see all these pictures of like the late 90s when The World Is Not Enough was coming out, and they had like the boat on display there apparently, and it just looked like this 90s like wonderland, and I wish I could have gone to see that version of the Dome particularly. I would have loved to have seen that.
I've never actually seen anything in the, now called the O2, obviously. I've never actually seen anything in there. It's worth doing the cable car thing above it. You kind of get World Is Not Enough vibes from that, because you can kind of see where all the locations were. I did actually have the chance to go to the Dome, and I went with my family either just before or just after the Millennium celebrations. And it was the weirdest experience. I promise this is going somewhere. It was the weirdest experience. The weirdest thing, the thing that stood out to me, and I think I was 17 at the time, was that there was this part of it was this exhibition where you went through a human body, but you started I think it was at the start. It's all kind of a bizarre blur in my head, to be honest, for reasons that will become readily apparent in just a moment. But what you entered this exhibition by going through a lady's legs.
Oh my God. Which
was very kind of James Bond For Your Eyes Only poster kind of. But then, no, I'm not making this up, Tom, unless I've made this up in a fever dream. Please, anyone listening to this who went to the Millennium Dome when it was in its original iteration, inside there was an exhibition where you walked through a lady's legs, and then you entered through her vulva. And around you, surrounded, were representations of pubic hair. And in amongst the pubic hair were pubic lice running around, and there were lights on it. I am not making this up, I promise.
Why wasn't that in The World Is Not Enough?
Well, quite. I mean,
you know, like it's perfect.
So I couldn't quite believe what the heck was happening. But yeah, it was... So yeah, that line, if it had it stayed in the film, well, at least it turned out to have some purpose, would have probably resonated with me and anyone else who managed to go to the original version of the Dome. But there is the Dome immortalized in a James Bond film forevermore.
I mean, it's funny when we're thinking about this, it struck me, there could be something I'm forgetting, but I don't think there's as many, or another Bond film that seems quite as stuck in time now I think about it as The World Is Not Enough, because it's not like it's particularly blatant, but between the mention of the Dome and the appearance of the Dome, the mention of the Millennium Bug at the end of the film. It's like it's such this little late 1999 thing. And I mean, as I was mentioning when I saw your background of the title sequence, there's all sorts of lovely like late 90s visuals, abstract visuals in that. And it's really interesting time capsule of film, I think, in a lot of ways.
Well, we'll get to the Millennium Bug joke because actually that ties in with the Christmas joke as well, but we'll get there. Just in terms of the immediate post titles, then we've got the scene with the female doctor who Bond seduces, called Dr. Greatrex for the first versions. I don't get it.
I don't get it. I was like, the best I could do is like Great Rack, and it's like it doesn't really work.
No, that doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
So eventually that gets changed from Dr. Greatrex, like the name, like sounding like a dinosaur, to Molly Warmflash in the Bruce Fierstein version. So I think we can credit Bruce with coming up with Molly Warmflash, which is a very 60s-esque Bond girl name, isn't it? The dialogue is very, very different in the Purvis and Wade version. So it kind of becomes pretty much the finished feature film by the Dana Stevens and then the Bruce Fierstein versions. We've already talked about the injury being his ribs, not his shoulder, which changes, of course, by the second draft. We get additional characters by the second draft. So we know we've got Robinson and Tanner by this point. So I believe that was because originally Michael Kitchen wasn't available for Tomorrow Never Dies. So they created the character of Robinson, played by Colin Salmon. But then when they came to World Is Not Enough, both of them were available. So they thought, right, we'll just put both of them in the film. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what my impression is too. And I quite like this sort of thing dynamic, the two of them.
Yeah, me too.
One thing that stood out to me in the second draft is, did you notice what Robinson's first name is, which I'm guessing is now?
Oh no, I didn't. I missed that.
It's mentioned once. Jeff.
Jeff.
I wouldn't have had him down as a Jeff either.
Jeff.
Jeff, yeah, Jeff.
Wow.
Jeff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not the first name I'd think of, if I'm honest.
No, it didn't. Yeah, but apparently I'm guessing it's canon. Like that's what it is now.
We do get quite a lot more names in this first version. So we get Cigar Girl's name. So Sashenka Firo is her name, and also Renard. Obviously he's finally Victor Zokas, isn't he? But he's kind of more French in this. He's Claude Serrault.
Yeah, which I suppose maybe makes the his name a bit more sense, because I know my French is a little rusty, but I believe Renard is French for
fox, yeah.
So I guess that was one of the things which is a legacy of that, is like he took his name of being French speaker, that he called himself Renard, and makes maybe less sense for Victor Zokas to call himself Renard. But
do you think that's to do with the casting? So when they cast, his name's just escaped me. Help.
Robert Carlyle.
There we go. When they cast Robert Carlyle, they're like, I don't think he can pass as a French guy.
This is like one of my running jokes. One of my friends is the Brosnan era's obsession with casting Scottish actors as Russian characters, because between Robert Carlyle, we've got Robbie Coltrane as Zukovsky, and they even dub the Russian colonel at the pipeline, not the pipeline, the nuclear facility is Robbie Coltrane dubbing him. So like, we've got to have a Scot. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I must have seen that film about 100 times. I never realized. Then I just was watching it a few years ago. I was like, that's Robbie Coltrane. Right? I looked it up and it was. Yeah, he dubbed this guy. And once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. It's just, I was like, I don't know what obsession they had.
I did not know that, but no, I'm replaying it in my head and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, it totally is.
Yeah.
Crazy. I didn't know that. The other things just to note I've written down here was the joke about I always love that part in the final film where Moneypenny and Warmflash kind of have a camaraderie, and like the way they leave the room, like Warmflash is like, I told you not to say anything to Moneypenny. That's kind of the body language. So I do get the feeling that everyone Bond has slept with at MI6, and I always maintain that Bond and Moneypenny did have a dalliance at a Christmas party. Everyone Bond has slept with is sort of in this kind of club, but then Moneypenny makes a joke after the exceptional stamina line. Moneypenny makes a joke, and this is our first female focused sex act of the podcast. It won't be the last. And Moneypenny says he's always been good at oral exams. So that's clearly a reference back to Tomorrow Never Dies, where we learn about Bond's linguistic ability. So that's a nice bit of continuity added in by Dana Stevens there. Sadly, that does get changed for the third draft. And actually, I quite like the his dedication to the job in hand or matter in hand in the finished film. So again, another sex act, not oral this time, but something else. So stay tuned for more as we go through the early drafts of The World Is Not Enough.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other bits here. We get 3 double O's just as we do in the finished film. It is specified, and there's no genders of the double O's because, of course, one is a woman in in the finished film. But they are 003, 004, and 009. Coincidentally, and I'm sure this is a coincidence, but I know Kim Sherwood is a big fan of The World Is Not Enough. But unless she's read this very early draft, this is just a coincidence. But they are the double O's in Double or Nothing. So 003, I mean the numbers, obviously, but 003, 004, and 009. So I thought that was a strange coincidence.
It's headcanon now. That's
totally.
I was also going to say, I think aren't they the 3 who get killed at some point as well? Like I'm having said that, I'm sure every 00 has been killed at some point. I was thinking 003's, I think it was Bill Fairbanks, right? Then 009 is
Octopus. 004 is We're Living Daylights.
Yeah. So having said that, we've also got 006. Also
God knows how many 009s meet us at the end as well. It's the worst one to have. But there's also a thread here that doesn't really get picked up until the Daniel Craig era, in that M is under pressure from government ministers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a really interesting sort of thematic thread that it just shows this interest that Purvis and we'd have with this idea of privatization in corporate sector and intelligence, which, as you say, gets brought up quite heavily at times, particularly in Spectre is the one that jumped to my mind in their era, in the Craig era. And you as I say, you see there's a lot of ideas that they clearly were fascinated by, which didn't maybe get picked up on in this film, which reappear a lot in the Craig era. And it's really
one thing that I would like to see reappear, so add it to the list when we get to write a Bond film, Tom, together. Mason and Lowbridge-Ellis as the writing duo to rival Purvis and Wade. Is the Bond is given some cover in the first draft as a PR spin doctor. I quite like that idea, but he's a spin doctor in crisis management, which is so brilliant. I love that idea that Bond has, because he's constantly managing crises, obviously, but he's kind of the corporate version of that. I really want that in a Bond film.
I really do as well. The Purvis and Wade draft, I'm just looking on one of my notes here, reminded me that they have this little dialogue exchange between Bond and M, where he says he insists, same as in the final film, he insists on being put on the assignment, and M's reticent, and Bond says he's been cleared physically for fitness, and M replies that it's not his fitness that she doubts, it's his mentality. And again, this is, I think, a big thread that gets picked up in the Craig Skyfall, and you could argue Quantum of Solace and Casino Royale a little bit as well, whether she trusts him and trusts his mentality. It's not like she has no doubts over his physical ability to do the job, it's his mental ability. And again, just already, it's the sort of the least thing that I would associate with the Brosnan era is sort of this like envy, I guess, of whether Bond can do the job. But again, it was possibly going to get introduced here as early as The World's Not Enough.
And then if we move to the Q scene, there were some substantial differences. R isn't here until the second draft by Dana Stevens. So that might have been when, I'm not sure, maybe it was casting reasons why R gets introduced here. Maybe they were kind of finding a way out for Desmond Llewellyn, although the line of always having an escape plan doesn't even appear in the third draft by Bruce Fierstein. So that might have been added on set.
Yeah, I think, again, we can, as you say, this really interesting thread of Desmond Llewellyn's involvement, and maybe they weren't sure at the start, because in this first Purvis and Wade draft, the lines that Tanner has in the briefing sequence talking about the bomb and the pin, that's all Q in that sequence. And we get this really nice little moment where he's in the middle of explaining about the detonator and things, and Bond comes in the meeting late, and everyone kind of looks at him, because in the Purvis and Wade draft, Bond has more blame, I think, attached to him by everyone else at MI6 for the bomb going off, whereas I feel like nobody really necessarily blames him that much directly in the final film. But as I say, Bond comes in late, and Q says, even I wouldn't have spotted the detonator there, to try and make him feel better. And I think it's really interesting development of their relationship. If you think of like from Goldfinger, you get this crotchety old man or older man, and sort of almost a rivalry between the two of them, because you feel like Q again doesn't like Bond very much. He's always disrespecting his gadgets. Then we go all the way through, and we've got these different, more fatherly moments, particularly, again in the Dalton era, and it's you get more of this father relationship, and then into the Brosnan era. But as you say, when we get into the actual Q scene, I wasn't there at first. He gets introduced, I think it's in the second draft, I believe, and he's also there in the third one. But as you say, we never get this thing about him retiring. So I feel maybe they were thinking he doesn't have to scale back his involvement, but didn't maybe think he would have to leave when he did. So I always think it's a bit of a shame that but sometimes a bit of a shame that he was so sadly killed when he was, that we never got a full, send off for him. But I guess, the retirement line and the way he left almost feels like yeah, it does certainly work, I think. There's one interesting line I found in the Q sequence, which he gives Bond a watch, which I could be misremembering, but I don't think is in the final film. He has the watch, he has the grappling hook watch, but I don't think there's one where Q actually gives it to him. But there is in the second and third draft. And at first, in the Dana Stevens version, Q says this is Bond's 29th watch. And then the third one, it becomes the 19th. I'm not sure whether it was supposed to be the 19th and it was a typo, or if it was just like a joke about how many he's had, and then Fierstein would find it. But of course, we get that same joke in Dine of the Day with, the 20th one. Yeah. And I think it kind of works better there, being the 20th film, it feels like a callback.
Totally. In terms of the gadgets, we've got a lot more gadgets in the first draft. Infrared contact lenses, a DNA ring which draws blood, which I can't help think should have probably been in Spectre. With the Spectre ring, and they do the fingerprint tracking off that. That would have worked really well there. The one which, I'll be honest, I reread this segment of the screenplay at least 4 times, and I'm still not sure I'm understanding it correctly, because it does rely on there being something of an innuendo, a visual innuendo, although God knows how they would have put this on screen. This is one of the weird bits. So am I reading this correctly? 2 men have microchips in their shoes. Electrical impulses go through the one's body into the other one, and then that basically is a way of transferring information. Is that kind of what is supposed to be happening here?
That's what I get from it. Yeah,
so we could be shaking hands, but actually in the act of shaking hands, making bodily contact, I pass information to the electrical device in your shoe.
Yeah.
So I presume that's feasible scientifically, because obviously our bodies have electrical impulses. The only problem is, this being a Bond film, and this is one of the things that hasn't been perfected yet, clearly, because this is where, again, I have to choose my language carefully, but one man's hair stands on end. So it's a bit like when you touch a Van de Graaff generator. And the other one, ... And Bond then says, it's a bit obvious. So am I to believe that the electrical impulses pass from one man to another? And I swear this is not just because I approach everything with queer lenses, Tom. Am I assuming that the electrical impulses actually give the other man an erection?
I mean, I must admit, I did not get that until you read your notes. But I don't know, I feel you could read it both ways. This ellipsis, it's is it the other man's hair that also stands on end? Is it something else? I mean, who knows?
I think it's something else. I think we're in Austin Powers territory here.
I mean, the interesting thing about that is, again, with the deleted scenes, they filmed something similar in the Q lab. Not anywhere near as suggestive, but there's a one little moment where one of Q's assistants, she is fiddling with this a Van de Graaff generator thing on a, in the late 90s, they're obsessed in the science, museums with those screens with electrical charges. When you pressed it and it would go to your finger and that sort of thing. She's playing one of these and her hair stands on end, and then she touches another assistant as he's walking past, and he goes flying on a wire thing. And Michael Apted's commentary said it was just total crap. It looked crap. It did look crap. He was right. It was right to remove it. But again, this idea of the hair standing on end, I think they must have thought it was funny until they filmed it and realized it wasn't. I think the erection joke probably a lot, you would have got some mileage from that, no doubt. I'd like to see Desmond Welland's reaction to it.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure quite how we would get that into a 12A, 12 rated Bond film, but hey, maybe they will find, maybe that will come back in another one. There are a couple of other gadgets as well, which do have a payoff later in this version of the first draft. Like there's a blade that fires out of the PPK, sticks out like almost like a bayonet. And which is probably a bit bloody actually when it eventually gets used in the film, which is probably why they didn't do it. And then the watch emits knockout gas, which we haven't had ever, as far as I'm aware.
The closest thing I can think of is like the tear gas in the Key Fob in Living
Oh
Daylight.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But no, we haven't had knockout gas. But I mean, the one thing I found quite funny that was Q was like, make sure to hold your breath. But he do was like, well, it is a bit of maybe a gadget with a limited usage when you're firing knockout gas from your own watch. It's like, I don't know, like,
Yeah, it is a bit, isn't it?
yeah,
But then eventually the mission begins. We've talked for about an hour really on these initial sequences, but the setup is quite different in some ways. But then the mission begins, and there are some differences here. There's a different car. It's a BMW 27, and I don't know the difference between that and the Z8 that appears in the film. It's black this time. The helicopter saws, which eventually get paid off at the Caviar Factory, are here from the very first draft, and I believe that was something Michael G. Wilson had always wanted to get in a Bond film.
yeah. I can't remember whether it was Goldeneye or Tomorrow Never Dies. I got a feeling it was Tomorrow Never Dies. He talks in one of the commentaries about having these buzzsaw helicopters in one draft because he'd seen them somewhere. And again, like so many of these great Bond ideas, it's somebody in the production team seen something somewhere and thinks, how can we fit this into the film? So yeah, it's obviously something they were interested in. And they're one of my more iconic things, I think, from that film. And I was pleased to see them in as early as there was, but as we'll get to, maybe slightly different deployment, I guess, and how they eventually used.
The meeting with Electra is a lot more streamlined in the finished film. Here he goes through the rigmarole of having a cover story. He actually uses the cover name David Somerset, which of course everyone listening to this will know is the cover that he uses in both the novel and the film of From Russia with Love. So there's a call back to there, but it doesn't take actually long for him to be outed as James Bond, and the line comes in here. So I don't know why they even bother giving him a cover story, to be perfectly honest.
I think that just feels like what I was saying before. Like they liked some of the little continuity bits from earlier films. Like why not make a reference to David Somerset? I guess as you say, he uses it and drops it basically in the same scene. It feels a little nearly near enough. It seems a bit redundant, but it's a nice. I would sort of think I would quite like to see now and then. I think am I remembering rightly that David Somerset is on the his business card in Quantum of Solace that he gives to Dominic Green's
No,
guy.
that's sorry. Oh my God, you've just got Bond wrong, Tom.
Oh
No,
my God.
that's Robert Sterling from
Oh, Sterling.
The Spy Who Loved Me.
Oh my God. I'm gonna get cited for that.
I'm sure that though that I'll protect you. I'm sure. Sounds like Bond and Electra now. I'll protect you, but I'm the one who needs protecting from you. Anyway, I'm pretty sure David Somerset is used as a cover somewhere else, and people are listening to this probably going, "Yes, it is," but I can't remember where it is.
In my defense, my central point is the same that I'd like to see some of these older things used now and then, like as a little reference to people who know more than me, apparently, who wouldn't be like, think, oh, gets it totally, that's the wrong thing. But yeah, I think it's just as I say, you see this throughout that they clearly. I mean, I know they're big Bond fans before they wrote this, but they feel like they've done a bit of, research and maybe watched all of the. I mean, I don't know what their work process was, but it feels like they've watched a lot of the prior films and picked little threads out throughout to maybe reference in this. I know in one of their interviews they were particularly, as everyone's who's seen No Time to Die will be well aware, they were big fans of Majesty's Secret Service, and one of the most interesting points I think they made was they thought, what if Blofeld was actually Tracy? That's sort of how they approached this with Electra's personality.
And there is actually kind of more callbacks to Honor Majesties in these versions. So well, actually, no, sorry, they're not in the original versions. And then third draft, we get Bruce Feirstein adding in, "Have you ever lost a loved one, Mr. Bond?"
Exactly.
And Bond saying, "I've had to give up loved ones," which does. So the first one does appear in the film, the second one doesn't.
Yeah, that's one of those moments that I was sort of alluding to earlier. Of I expected that to be something that was in there from the start with this Majesty's thread. I've always thought that's like, a deliberate nod, but it's really interesting that that was in there so late.
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
all ties in with this, as I say, this it almost feels like a stealth sequel, I think, of that film in some ways, with the amount of like little
If
nods that we see.
if people are interested and they haven't read it already, Sam Rogers actually did a brilliant piece for License to Queer where he compared the two films and drew all the parallels because he's obsessed with Honor Majesties and this film, particularly the female characters. So yeah, an extended kind of side by side comparison. That's over there on License to Queer.
It is excellent.
The Yeah. The other things that I thought were interesting in this setup is that there's far more rivalry between Bond and Davidoff, and Bond and Gabor, which you do get in the finished film. One of my favorite bits of World Is Not Enough is where it's a small moment, is not you, him, to Davidoff later on. But there's much more of this in this version. And the other thing that I thought was in all of these versions, actually, particularly the Bruce Fierstein version, the one that I found interesting, though, and again because of my queer point of view, is that, and I immediately kind of zone in on these bits, is that Gabor seems to be queer coded in the first draft of by Purvis and Wade. He's wearing an earring, and I can't remember if he does in the finished film, but it's noted in the stage directions. And also, there's a really lovely, really camp line from Electra. I mean, Electra is like the queen of camp anyway. But there's a brilliant line where she says that he's great at choosing outfits.
Yeah, that stood
And
out to me as well.
yeah, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, okay. We're supposed to think that Gabor is queer here, whereas actually he's kind of much more just like a hulking, like strong man in the film.
Mm. Yeah, that was. I think you're exactly right, because that stood out to me before you even mentioned it. I read your notes, so that stood out to me independently is the same sort of thing. And like you say, I think Davidov and Gabor feel like more rounded characters in some of these drafts, just
Yeah,
does not
yeah,
have this rivalry. Like in the third draft, I think it's interesting. I'm not sure whether it was filmed and then cut, or it was maybe cut really late, because this third draft is almost beat for beat what we get in the film, with some maybe a page or two changes and a few line tweaks and a one major one, which obviously we'll get to at the end. Um, but there's this nice exchange between Bond and Davidoff, where Davidoff knows that Bond works at MI6
yeah.
immediately because he used to work for Mossad.
Yeah, he's a former Mossad agent, which I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like, what? That was added in
Yeah.
the third draft.
Came out of nowhere for me too, but I think there's like it's a nice little sort of, what would the term be, like frenemy, I guess.
Yeah,
Like they kind of, they're being very cordial to each other. And when I was reading, I thought, oh, they guess they kind of like each other a bit, but then there's a little bit towards the end where it suggests that actually they still don't trust each other, and it's all a bit frosty. And it's really, again, really interesting, because Davidoff is one of those things where he's such a minor player in the film, but he always kind of stands out to me. I don't know, it's just the performance or like a few of the moments he's involved with. And to give him a bit more character, I think would have been nice.
yeah,
Instead of Gabor, again, Gabor, so little screen time, but I was like, I when I think of the film, he and Bullion and the more minor henchmen, I think, kind of stand out.
yeah.
Would have been nice.
A couple of other bits I thought of noteworthy. Electra uses the phrase "everything or nothing" at some point, which has never appeared in the dialogue of Bond films, but obviously is one of those Bond phrases. The apocryphal origin of the name Eon, which apparently is not a thing, but eventually got used as the title of the 2004 video game with Pierce Brosnan, which was actually I really enjoyed playing. There's also a reference to the Devil's Breath in the first version. They fly over it, but then nothing is really done with it. Whereas actually, even by the third draft here, we don't really have that. Do we even have the Devil's Breath sequence in version 3? I'm trying to remember. I know it comes later.
It is.
I think
Similar
we
to
do
you,
by version 3, don't we?
I gave it a quick read over before this, because I was unsure of the timetable of this part of the film
But
specifically.
we do get it mentioned in the first draft, so that's interesting. It must have just been part of their research that got expanded for the introduction of Bernard. And I know that Devil's Breath sequence was shot at Pinewood, so I think that was probably a very late change when they decided they weren't going to introduce Renard in the pre-title sequence instead.
Yeah, because I really love that part of the film. In fact, in the third draft, this little almost horror movie-ish bit, which again I'm not sure whether it was filmed and then cut or just didn't make the final thing, where it plays out very similar to the final film of, you know, Renard shooting Arkov and handing the rock to Davidoff and that sort of thing. And but then when, you know, it says, oh, we cut in on Davidoff who's looking at his burned hand, and he looks up and Renard and everyone have just gone, and it's just him and Arkov's body left in the clearing. And it's
Yeah.
just I just love these bits of Renard being like more than or something beyond human. I just think he had the potential to be a really creepy. I mean, he is still quite creepy, I think, in the final film, but just little moments like that, I wish had been kept in just to sort
Yeah,
of.
I would have appreciated a bit more weirdness, I suppose. You're
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So the Devil's Breath sequence actually happens after the ski. I know we've kind of skimmed over the ski sequence, but as we're on it, so the Devil's Breath sequence does actually happen. There's also a scene which introduced Renard in the first draft where a hawk digs talons into his hand, demonstrating that he can't feel pain even though he's got blood streaming from his hand. So as far as I'm aware, I'm trying to remember, there's no Bond villain who's used a hawk before as one of their arsenal, but yeah, that's there. Do you want to talk about the skiing sequence? Because it is very similar. I've called it the Ice Bandits sequence because I always think that is a supposed to be a pun on the soundtrack by David Arnold, Ice Bandits, and I'm not going to say it again. If you haven't quite got the joke, then it's probably a bit of a British slang term. Let's put it that way for something that's we're not going to talk about. So which I always think is a reference back to Snow Job by John Barry in View to a Kill. But anyway, moving swiftly on, but weirdly, Bond uses a whip to arrest his fall from an ice bridge, and I couldn't help think of No Time to Die in the pre-title sequence there, where he uses those ropes to kind of swing through a bridge.
That's true. Yeah, I was just more like Indiana Jones. I must have made the whip, and it just it's one of those things where I never quite bought it reading it. It feels a little odd. I mean, it's an interesting enough idea, but again, I do like what we got, to be honest. I think the which again is some changes even from the third draft, because one of the most interesting points of that sequence to me is the fact that Bond is unarmed. I mean, Renard even brings it up in the Devil's Breath sequence later on. It says, you know, like, oh, Bond was unarmed. Like, what excuse you got? But all the way to the third draft, I can't remember what he does in the first, but certainly in the second or the third, he's got a gun. He's still got his Walther, and he uses it to shoot, you know, some of the Parahawk pilots, that sort of thing. And the Renard dialogues changed to Bond only had a pistol, which I think is maybe less impactful. So I'm not sure at what point, maybe it was during shooting, the thought, let's remove the weapons entirely and just have him use his skis and the surrounding environment to get rid of the pursuers. I think a much more interesting sequence of just straight up shooting them, you know, because there's something that's a bit, you know, anticlimactic.
Yeah. So after that action sequence, then we have the introduction of Renard, and then we have the Casino Noir d'Or, which survives into the finished version, and he's right here from the beginning. But actually, it's hosting a conference in the first version of the Caspian Oil Producers Association, where Electra gets her Elliot Carver moment and gets to give a keynote lecture on the state of the world and the oil industry and everything there. Zukovsky's there, of course, and he owns the place. Interesting, the stage direction is a modern day Casablanca, so there are spies from around the world. I'm not sure I got that in the finished film, if I'm honest.
No, I always just kind of assumed there were, you know, criminals, Zukovsky's thugs sort of thing. I never really got that, which is a shame because it's an interesting idea, I think.
Yeah, there is a sequence where Zukovsky introduces a prostitute named Martini and asks Bond, "How would you like her?"
I did kind of love that line. It's a clever one, I think.
Clever line, also a bit seedy, but you know, probably quite fitting for the character. And picking up the theme of what we've talked, which has already been established in this early first draft of the film, Zukovsky offers Bond to go into business with him, as countless Bond villains have done in the past, of course. But it does maintain that thread and pushes into the foreground of Bond possibly being drawn away from public service into private life.
Yeah, because I suppose now I've thought a bit more about it, it's a extension of what we've already seen with Zukovsky in Goldeneye, you know, this ex-spy. I mean, obviously it's not quite legitimate what he's doing in Goldeneye, but by the finished film in World's Not Enough, it is. He's supposedly a legitimate businessman with this casino and caviar factory and that sort of thing. So I guess that's maybe like the one vestige we get in the final film of this purpose and weird thread of people from the Cold War, because Zukovsky mentions the Cold War, doesn't he, in this first draft directly,
Yeah.
about what's your relevance after that, and he's decided he's not going to be in the KGB anymore. He's going to go and do something else, and it's just it's a really fascinating little moment, I think.
Yeah. We get Mr. Bullion introduced in the third draft, so I think he's a Bruce Fierstein creation. He does have a backstory in that he's wanted for genocide in Rwanda, which is a contemporary reference again, which would have dated the film, but also quite topical now in Britain about Rwanda, but we'll leave that one there as well. So, yeah, we don't get that in the finished film. There's a few other differences as well. So in the second version, we have another Zukovsky henchman called Boa, and he's presumably called that because he likes to strangle people like a boa constrictor, which is a little bit on the nose. But interestingly, I wonder if we'll ever get that. A lot of strangulation happens in Bond films, so maybe they were giving that one a rest after Goldeneye and so forth. Yeah, there is a bizarre sequence which I actually really loved in the second draft, the Dane Stevens version, where Davidoff is essentially honey trapped by a prostitute, and he's looking at her face, and then he looks away, and then suddenly Renard's face appears in the mirror. So again, a sublimely queer moment in a sense, because he's gone there to essentially have sex with a woman, and then it's swapped for Renard. So a very strange sequence. And the confrontation of the Devil's Breath scene in the finished film and the third draft is actually pouring hot oil over Davidoff's head in a hotel room, which is probably more sinister than the version we actually got.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, it's just that mirror shot stood out to me too. Is again this sort of horror movie almost moment. It's scary. I found that could be quite almost like a jump scare, I guess, or probably the way they ended.
It is, yeah.
And I feel like I keep saying it, but it just feels like, as much as I love Renard that we got, another film we got, I do wish there was more of this factor in
creepiness.
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's throughout all these drafts and throughout the whole film, and it feels like so much of it got removed for one reason or another. The main thing that stood out to me in this casino sequence is the casino game and how it got, for want of a better term, I guess, watered down by the final film, because it's always been a bit of an eye roll moment to me. If I could make one, criticism of the film is like, who goes to a casino and plays high card? It's basically, what is it? It's called Casino War or something. Just draw the high card, because of course the whole thing is like Electra's supposed to be covering
Zukovsky.
Exactly. Yeah. Why would you be so platist to play high card?
It is blatant, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could argue that's maybe kind of the point, and she just doesn't care. She's just showing, But the each of the three, I mean, I'm saying each of the three. I'm pretty sure it's the same in the first draft, but certainly the second and third have a blackjack sequence or a 21 sequence. That's what they end up playing. Except I think in the third one they play a blackjack. It's a really interesting description of Bond and Electra playing it literally together, where he's putting his hand on her hand and moving the cards around, that sort of thing.
Again, that would have probably been a callback to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because obviously there's more of it's not a massive card game, but it's bigger than the one that we get in the finished film with World Is Not Enough. The thing that I found most interesting about this segment is that Electra's presentation changes a lot from the first draft to the second draft. I think we can actually credit Dana Stevens with the Electra that we really got in the finished film, because I'm trying to find the right words to describe how Electra came across to me in the first draft. The best version I got was a one-note nymphomaniac. She is just, it's so obvious that she's just trying to get Bond into bed. She's far more upfront sexually. She even whispers in his ear in this sequence. Bear in mind, they've only just met. She says, "I'm a fire." She's described as predatory in the stage directions, and I can't say this aloud because of my profession. However, we are told that they're going to F word in the screenplay, and I'm like, yes, we got it. We really got it. It's so unsubtle if you compare it with what we get in the finished film, which is basically what's written in the Dana Stevens second draft.
It's like I think we can exemplify this with one particular dialogue exchange in that first draft where Electra is it comes immediately after that stage direction you mentioned where Electra's still playing the game. Electra says, "One more hand, I'm not licked yet." And to which Bond replies, "Stand or split them."
Yeah.
It's like we're almost getting into Austin Powers territory here for me. Like it's there's innuendo and there's innuendo. This is the ladder, and it's
And what I said at the start, it being so adolescent, we have all this, for want of a better word, foreplay going on. But when we actually get to the sex scene, there's a cutaway. So they end up looking up at the night sky, and then immediately the next shot is they've had sex. So all but smoking cigarettes at this point.
yeah.
Whereas in the Dana Stevens version, you actually see the sex take place, and it's the no more ice sequence. That is not in the first draft, and that is such a key sequence for Bond and Electra's relationship. Without that, I don't think we'd have really bought their relationship at all.
I would agree. Yeah, it's much more adult, I guess,
Yeah,
both literally and metaphorically in these
yeah.
third draft.
The thing that I just want to note from the first draft as well, in terms of, again, it's really unsubtle here, but Electra keeps a gun under her pillow. Do you keep a gun under your pillow? So Electra keeps a gun under a pillow, but it sets up the original version of the Christmas Jones joke. Yes, we will eventually get there, listeners, where Bond says, mine's, he finds the gun under her pillow, and he says, "Mine's fully loaded." And Electra says back, essentially, deadpan, "On safety, I hope. Wouldn't want it to go off suddenly." So premature climaxing, sexual incontinence, to use the technical term, he's actually kind of baked into this script a lot earlier on. Which eventually sets up the original version of the Christmas joke, which is about premature climaxing.
I mean,
so it seems to be a bit of an obsession of this script.
yeah, because at any moment that they can have, like, even that this whole sequence isn't at Electra's house, it's on a yacht, which is also called Electra, and it makes a big point of the name being on the bow. So Bond literally gets aboard her before like anything. And it's just like any excuse they can have for like any bit of visual or dialogue innuendo or anything. It's just it's impressive, I would say, like literally impressive how much they could cram into this. And I totally agree with you that I think Electra is a much more developed and rounded character, I think, from this second draft. I mean, I don't, again, you may disagree, I don't think the third draft changes her that much. I think a lot of it there after the second one, but you know, for the right reason. I don't think it needed to be changed. She was
I don't want to do that reductive thing where people say, you know, around, like, with a lot of people were speculating that Phoebe Waller-Bridge had been brought on to No Time to Die to punch up the female characters, but Dana, and that was not the case. She did that, you know, some of her biggest contributions were like the Blofeld sequences and so on and so forth. And that whole reductive idea of, because you're a woman, you can write female characters. But in this instance, Dana Stevens, she's made so many contributions here, which is why we think she's the unsung hero.
Yeah, I agree.
But the thing that makes the film work the way it does is because she basically created the character of Electra.
I think the Electra that Sam and so many other people love is her.
Yeah.
Electra. I think, you know, but if we had got the one from the first draft, I don't think she would have been anywhere near as impactful a character she is to clearly so many people, because the amount of people I see mention her as one of favorite Bond characters at all, even if you don't go into villains or women or anything like that, even or sub characters, just generally. And I'd be inclined to agree, because she's very unique, for better or worse, I guess. You know, we haven't had that much of a similar character since then.
There are a few other small differences, like we get the first mention in the first draft in the sex after they've had sex, we get the first mention of Orbis non sufficit, which of course doesn't come into the film until much later in the finished version. But the whole thing about her taking off her earring is there in the second draft. So again, we can credit that with Dana Stevens. Also in the second draft, and this might have been intriguing and add to the creepy vibes around Renard, we do get a sequence where Renard is shown watching Electra and Bond get intimate as they leave the casino.
Yeah.
And it would play with that idea of, is he jealous of Bond, which eventually comes into the Dana Stevens draft, which is the scene we get in the film, like, but much later on.
Yeah, because it specifically says he's watching them from a rooftop through binoculars, and I guess it was implied there was a POV shot here where he's specifically looking at Bond's hand on the bottom of Elektra's back. And so I think there definitely is something there about him being jealous of the two of them. And he mentioned something about, oh, I'll deal with him in time, whatever. And he knows that he's got to just let it go for his plan. And I think it's the two of them, they're this really interesting dichotomy, I think, Renard and Elektra. And
Yeah.
I think it's maybe a bit underappreciated sometimes in the film, just how interesting because I know Calvin did an interesting video recently about who is the main villain of The World Is Not Enough, and a few other people have started talking about it. And it's something that I think again we see more from this Dana Stevens draft rather than the first one. But again, you may disagree. I don't know whether you think it's there from the beginning as well, but I think it's...
No, I think it's there.
Yeah.
That whole who's the real villain, I always think, even to the extent of Die Another Day, I think Miranda Frost is the real villain of Die Another Day. She's the one who, I know she's doing it probably under the orders of Moon/Graves, but she's the reason why he ends up in prison for all those months in Korea. And it's almost like the film, like especially in the music, it plays up that that she's like the big bad at the end. And it's almost like Graves, much as his death scene is brilliant, it's almost like Graves is kind of like the afterthought in a sense. And then there's the whole thing around Brosnan's era where, who dies first? Is it the villain or is it the hench person? So but we're going to get sidetracked.
One last thing that struck me in that sequence, and I guess you can mention sort of it pans out the film overall, is you mentioned about Elektra taking off her ear and her ear being disfigured in the from the second draft onwards. Her injuries in the person Wade draft are much less visual, I would argue. I think she mentioned something about having like some scars on her neck or bruising on her neck or something like that. It's very it's certainly not as, like I say, as obvious. And it's small neck scars in the first draft. And I think you can get in, like, I know you've written a fair bit about things like this, but you're getting like this interesting territory of Bond villains and disfigurement and the various aspects of that trope. And I guess you could look at it both ways, that maybe her having more of a visual disfigurement in the other drafts is sort of plays more into that trope, but I guess it maybe makes it a little more interesting when she's seen as not being a villain, that she has this. Though I suppose you'd have to say it by the finished film, we don't find out about it until we know she's a villain. It's really revealed much earlier in this second draft. There's also a remark about the fact that they sent her ear to her father, the bit that got cut off. I think it's really gory detail that kind of gets omitted from the final film. I think that's reminds me of like real life kidnapping victims and cutting body parts off and sending them, that sort of thing.
On that depressing note, we're going to move into the next action sequence. So very much like the film, we end up going to a place where warheads are being decommissioned. There's detail in the first draft about the moving the warheads around is a King operation. So it's almost like Elektra's in on it even more. So it's not in the finished film. It's, they're decommissioning Russian military warheads, aren't they? Or I think they're Russian military warheads, but King is involved. The King Corporation is involved anyway. But the most important thing here is, of course, getting introduced to Christmas in this sequence. And there's this description of her, which is in all three of the versions we're looking at today, is that she's, even though Christmas differs in lots of ways, she's described as hot right now in all versions. So presumably it's basically whatever looks hot right now, whatever's on the cover of Lads Mags, this being 90s, and in Britain we had these horrendous magazines which played to the lowest common denominator of, as a gay person I was just rolling my eyes, but a fair few straight men were rolling their eyes as well back in 1999. So it's essentially what would appear on the cover of a Lads Mag. And that description is there in the screenplay right from the first draft. But Christmas differs in many regards. So originally she's French Polynesian. So that's a significant difference. She also has, in the second version, she has a peace tattoo, which I think would have been pretty cool. I don't know if it's there in the finished film. We just don't see it. I've never spotted it.
there
Is it
because I know
there?
Denise Richards has mentioned it in an interview at some point about this fake tattoo. But I
Wow.
don't, as you say, I really don't think it's particularly evident because something I always find interesting is like people have this when people knock the character of Christmas Jones, they always mention like, oh, she wears skimpy outfits and no, physicist would dress her. Like it's for one sequence. It's in that she wears, fairly conservative clothing, I
Yeah,
think, for
yeah.
the rest of the film. So of course you can't really see the tattoo because she's not really wearing anything that exposes it. But it is there. She's mentioned that you can see it in that one sequence. I don't know if it's a
How
piece
can you?
tattoo, but it is a
Because
fake. She's got a tattoo and a
so I love Christmas Jones in the finished
yeah,
film
same here.
because she's underdeveloped as a character. But I just love the whole presence of, and Denise Richards just plays it completely straight the whole time through, and it is like pure camp in that sense because it's not, well, it is kind of obviously kind of tipping over the edge, but I do love the character in the finished film. But there is a part of me reading these scripts which thinks, I would have loved to have had a little bit more characterization and also a bit more agency for the character. I don't
Yeah,
think
I
she's
agree.
missing agency in the finished film, but there are several things here which she does throughout the rest of the film, which you go, oh, it would have been so good. And it would have just been slight tweaks here or there. I mean, even the first sequence in the first draft, and it does make her kind of like, the thing is that purposely where you get criticized for, which is actually one of the reasons I love Die Another Day, is that everyone talks in sexual innuendo, not just Bond. And that kind of gets edited out of this version, and then it's very much in Die Another Day. But the first time that Bond meets Christmas Jones, he goes, "The name's Bond, King Industries." And then she says, "Your equipment is very impressive," because obviously it's a King operation. He's representing King. So that wouldn't work in the later drafts where they change those details. But she's kind of giving as good as she gets right from the off.
Yeah, I mean, this again may just be me looking too far into it, but that particular one struck me as a deliberate callback to one of my personal favorites. I've never decided whether it was deliberate or not. Innuendos from You Only Live Twice, where Blofeld's talking with um the backers of his plan, and says, "My congratulations, gentlemen, on your fantastic equipment," and they say, "Like your congratulations on how you handle it." And it's like,
Yeah.
was it deliberate? Probably, and I got sort of like vibes of a callback to that. I really, again, as you say, I love the little dialogue moments like that.
Yeah. There's also, I suppose, we'll come back to Christmas in a minute, but there's so much more to say about her. But we get the first proper introduction to Renard here.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, the first time that Bond meets Renard in all of the versions of the film. What I thought, and maybe it's just reading it on the screenplay compared to how it translates to film, the build up to actually finding Renard is nowhere near as tense in the screenplay, whereas actually it's one of my favorite parts of the film, and it helps that David Arnold's music is just incredible,
I
full
agree.
stop, but particularly in that sequence. And when he eventually faces off against Renard and ambushes him, it's much better than all of these versions, because there are some versions where he sees him from across the room and they have kind of like a slanging match across the room. I think the version in the film is the best version.
I would agree, and I agree with you about the score particularly. I also think I've never quite decided where I stand largely on it, but I know I've seen over the years some people kind of knock the directing of the film a bit because, of course, Michael Apted was much well known for doing documentaries rather than action films, and there's been comments on whether it's some of the shots maybe the best, but I will say I do love the sequence of shots, as you say, when Bond goes into the facility and he's looking for not. There's one particular one where he's going down on the lift and it's like a really like a high angle of him
I love
descending
that.
down, looking up, and it's a really good combined with the score. It is much more tense, I feel, and probably the only element of Renard me feeling creepier in the final film than in the drafts, because it does kind of bring him up to be like a bit more um of a presence, I think, in a threat, and the whole this whole sequence, I think, in the scripts, other than the third one, which was really interesting because I felt I could visualize exactly what I was reading because it was so close to the finished film. Except there was one moment where when Bond chases Renard into with the warhead into the tunnels, and it mentions Bond shoots the lights out to make his part of the tunnel go dark so he can't be seen. I think that would have been a really interesting little moment. I loved the description of that. But yeah, by the third draft, we get basically
Yeah.
what we get on screen. But I think even the second one is very close. I'm not sure again how much credit we can give to Dana Stevens
Mm,
for this particular sequence.
mm.
There's a
Yeah,
lot.
the bunker scene is basically he's revised heavily for the second draft. We
Yeah,
even get the payoff of James Bond in escaping up the
yeah,
shaft and
yeah.
that thing, which is one of my favorite bits in the film. It's just so like cheesy. I love it.
Mm.
There is an interesting line of dialogue in the Dana Stevens version where Renard, and it's in there in the finished film. Half of it is he said you should have seen her before. I think it's had her before in the
Yeah.
finished film. But then he follows it up by saying flawless and not such a whore in bed.
Mm.
So lovely. Okay, I'm sort of glad we cut that line from the
Yeah,
finished film. If I'm honest,
yeah.
it's a bit kind of like hard boiled, which Bond has never really been. Even the last line of Casino Royale, the book, is kind of like half hearted, isn't it? And brilliantly
Yeah.
translates great. So I didn't really like that. When they was there anything else about the bunker before we start moving towards the pipeline and the caviar factory?
Um, no, not especially, no, because it's one of those things where I think there's maybe less to say because it's so close to the final film.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's
Yeah.
quite interesting to see the things that I really love about the finished film start to creep into. The initial idea is there. I mean, the way Bond escapes, the bomb and everything is different. All of those details are different, but it's being ironed out as you go through the different version. One thing I did notice, and one of the points that I actually, to be honest, it confused me for the first few times I watched the film, when they talk about, just to backtrack a bit before he gets to the bunker area, it's the, have you got the grease?
Yeah.
Basically, it's kind of commentary on Western goods having
Mm.
being so scarce that people wanted them back in the 90s, and I presume to an extent nowadays.
Yeah.
But the trainers change in the second draft. They're Nike trainers, which is where that whole idea comes from. In the second draft, it's not there in the first one, and then the third one, it's Adidas, which I
Yeah.
think is the one in the finished
I
film. So
think so.
probably
Yeah.
probably reflecting the brand partner
I
that
was going to
they
say there'll
decided
be
to
some
go with.
contracts
Yeah,
signed somewhere with that.
it is
It,
quite interesting. Once you like with the car as well, which is different. You can. It's like the writers must know this is going to change depending on who Eon
mm.
make a deal with.
There was while we're talking about that bit, actually, there was one bit that struck me which I found quite interesting, and it was I was a bit disappointed almost I didn't go where I was expecting to in the draft because this after Bond shoots Davidoff in the third draft, he's sort of frisking him to get his ID and things, and but Davidoff's got this mobile phone on his belt and it
Yeah.
rings, and Bond picks it up and it's Renard on the other end, and he basically gives him like the transponder code for
Yeah.
because in this draft the player needs a transponder code to get past air defense, otherwise it's going to get shot down.
Yeah.
And Bond only says yes twice, but then when Bond meets Renard in the facility, Renard speaks first. Like Renard's coming down the lift behind Bond. I thought, oh, he's gonna, blow. You're gonna know he's gonna know it was Bond the whole time from when he answered the phone and he just let it play out. But it turns out no, he's like it's like oh, if it's his in the stage actions, Renard is like momentarily surprised that it's Bond. I thought that's a bit weird. Like was Bond supposed to be putting a voice on the phone? I kind of like the idea, like because as I say, I do like I like Renard's more calculating and creepy villain. I like those aspects in it, and I would have liked the thought of him knowing and letting it play out and playing Bond the whole time, which he kind of does a bit anyway because he knows that's what's going to happen. But I would have liked to maybe a bit more obvious, I guess.
Yeah. And then there's the sequence where, well, this is quite different actually in the different versions. So I've called it the finding the bomb sequence. But M does reveal that MI6 will look really bad as they were involved in moving the warheads. So again, that's playing the first draft. That's playing in the idea that M and King are kind of in cahoots with each other in a sense. It's only in the Dana Stevens version where M is lured into the field. So we don't get that, which is of course a part of the story from Colonel Sun, the Kingsley Amis continuation book, where M is actually in jeopardy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That really struck me because of course so many people use that as a Purvis and Wade trope. M has to go in the field while and it's like it turns out it wasn't them at all. It was Dana Stevens.
Or blame Kingsley Amis or Dana Stevens if you don't like it. Personally, I love it, and it's one
I
of
do,
the best
yeah,
the
me
best
too.
elements of The World Is Not Enough, having
Yeah.
M as part of the mission.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's one of those things which I love in that film, but I must have maybe devalues by its repetition. Like, like the by the Craig era, the flying Judi Dench around every, like the one that really I think is egregious is the end of Die Another Day, which is in the control room in
Yeah,
Korea and almost
probably. Yeah.
dies. And it's like, why? Just got no reason to be there. We've got Judi Dench, we best use her. And I mean, Judi Dench is incredible as M, but it's like, could we not have written something different where,
Mm,
like, I don't know, just that doesn't really feel right for me. But I think in this film, for this film, particularly with her relationship with Electra, it works so well. I agree, it's one of my favorite aspects of the film as well.
yeah. The idea that Stockholm Syndrome might be playing a part of Electra's character is introduced in the Dana Stevens draft, and it's introduced a lot sooner. Well, a bit sooner. Oh no, actually, it's actually introduced quite late in this film, but then Bruce Fierstein moves it earlier in the third version. I was actually reading the other day that Stockholm Syndrome has been debunked. It's not a thing. But for the in terms of pop psychology, which the Brosnan films have a lot of popular psychology in them, this is sort of an explanation as to her character. But I love that it's the wrong way around. That actually it's Renard who's the one who's been infatuated with her. I do love that part of the film. The thing that I've really noted here, though, is that Christmas's agency really comes through here. So in the first version, she phones when they can't find the bomb. She tracks the bomb down through satellites by phoning up an ex-boyfriend. So she's not afraid to call on past flames like Bond isn't as well. So having said that, she's also a bit of a French stereotype. So she's, French Polynesian, this version, remember, but she's constantly smoking. So I'm just like, and some of the things she says are a bit like, oh God, like, are we caricaturing someone who speaks French here?
It is, yeah, it was. I don't know whether, again, like we were talking about with Renard, whether this was maybe a casting thing and they maybe had an idea of where they would go after this first draft. But the French Polynesian thing, I think, is an interesting. Though, as you say, maybe we go a bit too, like I was half expecting her to just pull a bottle of wine out or something halfway. And it's like, wow, it's just it just goes. She drops like Monsieur and that sort of thing in a dialogue fairly regularly in little sort of French terms, and it's an interesting
the
character.
other in the second version, she still has more agency because after the attack at the pipeline control center, we're told that she has 10 crews combing the area. She has that power to just get all of these personnel, to do what she needs them to do. So that would have been nice, but maybe it was filmed. I don't know. It would have given her more reason to be there because in the end, there is no real reason for her to be there. It's like someone's going to have my and that's literally the only reason, which is revealed later on, for her to kind of stick around. So it's all a bit nebulous in the finished film, whereas she does actually have a reason to be there here.
Yeah, it is a real shame because, as you say, I also like Christmas a lot, and I do feel like if we'd kept some of these bits of agency. I think didn't we talk about this with Anya Masova as well in Spine Love Me, that some of these earlier drafts maybe give her a bit more character, especially the one where she kills Stromberg herself, and that felt like such a great moment. Because of course she's the one who was kidnapped by him or something. Maybe she was more apt.
We also get an identity for the report. So the report actually in the Dana Stevens version was not well, it could be the sort of similar thing, but it wasn't MI6 weaponry. It was actually the manual for the stolen bomb. So we thought, oh, right, okay. So they've got this bomb, so they needed to know how to use it. So that was an interesting detail. I thought, oh, right, okay, yeah, because we never even questioned that in the film, that they've got together people who know what to do with a nuclear bomb.
I think that even survived to the third draft because there's in some way, I don't know whether it was directly that, but there's a stage direction in the bunker sequence where it says, "Oh, Bond looks over," and one of Renard's men's using a manual to remove the locator card from the thing. It's like,
right,
it almost feels like, how could we not play this for laughs? It's like, what, your IKEA instructions for your nuclear bomb, and like, take the locator card out. But it is true, yeah. I mean, I must admit, I never questioned how they could, do this, but it makes sense, like how.
What happens next then in the next sequence actually is different in the first draft. there's actually a major structural revision in the Dana Stevens version. So in the Purvis and Wade original, the first draft, the caviar factory sequence happens right after this sequence, where they're trying to track the bomb. Whereas from the second version onwards, the pipeline sequence happens here, and then the caviar sequence.
Yeah,
I think that move was fundamental to the success of the film, to be honest. To go from bomb to finding the bomb, I think is much, much better. So in the Purvis and Wade version, we have the caviar factory sequence, which is basically the same as the finished film. This is probably the sequence of the film which had the least changes, I thought, Tom.
Yeah,
Are you on that page? Yeah.
Yeah, I almost, because we mentioned it in passing earlier, I almost wonder whether, you know, Michael G. Wilson or somebody maybe had a hand in structuring it, because like, as I'm pretty sure that you're right that the idea for these helicopters came from him, or something he wanted to do. So I don't know whether this was maybe a sequence that they'd envisioned before maybe even starting to write the thing. Probably they just knew they wanted to do this at some point, to maybe explain why it stays so similar throughout. But I totally agree with you that I think changing things round really makes a difference. I think it really, really improves the film.
For a start, the reveal that Elektra is the villain happens during this sequence, but it's not face to face. It's revealed in some dialogue with Zukovsky, and it's like, oh, okay, that's a bit of a damp squib. So there's no big reveal that Elektra is the villain, which is a real problem. There's also a weird bit where Christmas Jones falls in a pool of sturgeon, and he's pulled out. It's kind of like, you know, instead of sharks, I don't know how deadly sturgeon are, but they try to get her out as rapidly as possible. So yeah, I don't really, the caviar factory in terms of action sequence is basically the same. It's slightly different action moments, but it has the same outcome. But the sequencing of it it doesn't work as well. Whereas, you know, we'll come back to the caviar factory because we're going to try and stay in film order when we look at the second and third versions of it. So let's talk about the pipeline sequence.
Yeah.
So again, this is very similar as in the film, with the big difference in the first draft is Emmy's not at risk. But she does, I think, pretend Bond is dead, or she does actually genuinely think Bond is dead to kind of draw Elektra out. I wasn't quite sure, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to read it either. I mean, I like to think it was just, you know, pretending, I guess, partly because part of me thinks, how many times in one film can we do the, you know, people actually
Bond's
dead? Yeah. It's like up to twice now already. We're only like 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah.
But I think having you know, try and hoodwink her a bit was quite interesting. Like, if that's what they were intending on, I think that maybe gives her a bit of agency. It's an interesting thing for her to do. But I mean, you think M would know by now that Bond isn't dead. I mean, how many times this must happen? 200 times since she knew him. Like, he's obviously not dead. But yeah, I just think the whole thing really benefited from the rewrite, because it like I could be misremembering this, but the sort of M, as you say, M just isn't really in the same level of danger as in the other drafts, right? No. And again, to me, that's such a fundamental part of the film. Like that's
totally.
That's a key part of it. And it's again, while I mentioned before, it's something that maybe they did a bit too much in the later films. Again, this is just such a new concept. M's always been like remote and away from the action, and to have them put in direct danger, as you say, it's maybe from, you know, it's been touched on in I think also a few of the John Gardner novels, you know, had sort of something similar. And I guess now it comes to me, they were going to have M kidnapped in was it Diamonds Are Forever, where he was
going he was going to join a hippie colony, wasn't he?
Yeah, and it's like, oh my god, so we nearly had this years ago, apparently. But, yeah, it's
the pipeline sequence itself. I know we've kind of jumped ahead to afterwards, but the pipeline sequence itself, as you said, is very, very similar to the film right from the first draft. There is some lovely dialogue with Christmas that doesn't make it past the second version. So Dana Stevens had Bond saying, after this, should we celebrate with a champagne dinner or brunch? So it's kind of, there's some nice, like, genuinely, like, nice repartee between them that isn't just sexual innuendo in the second version. And I really like that, to be honest.
I do as well. Because I know you were you were saying you quite like it in some respects with Purvis and Wade, but I must admit, like, having people not just be quip machines and a bit of
People on heat constantly. Yeah,
yeah, it is
it does
nice.
get a bit wearing. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Um,
The other thing is as well, in the first version, we do see Renard and Electra have sex. He was a good lover, that scene, and it's
yeah.
very similar in the film. But also Christmas and Bond sleep together in the Istanbul hotel room. So remember this detail for when we get to the end, because it will eventually have a payoff. Okay,
Yeah.
but they have to sleep together for the ending of this version of the first version, the Purpose and Way version, to work. Okay, so Christmas and Bond sleep together in Istanbul. Yeah,
Mm,
remember that.
that happened in the first
That
one.
happens.
Yeah.
The other parts of this are very similar. There's no Maiden's Tower here, which I think was added probably after location scouting and
Yeah,
does
I agree.
appear from the second version. And then Zukovsky reveals his nephew's in command of the submarine. There's a whole stuff in all of these versions about a plasma lathe, which is the
Yeah.
thing that is glowing blue in the film, which pulls out the radiation core or what. I don't know what's going on. But in this version, we get all of this exposition about a plasma lathe. And I'm like, yeah, we don't need that. So I'm glad all of that went.
Somebody, one of either Purvis and Wheel or somebody else read about wanted something like that in a magazine somewhere and wanted. I can tell there's the fingerprints of Maybaum all over this. Of
Yeah, totally.
read something in a magazine and it sounds really cool. But yeah, we don't need the cool laser. I think's enough in the final four.
Yeah.
I don't really stop to question how Renard made his rod. Like it.
Let's not question Renard's rod, shall we? We'll just leave it there. And then there's some really interesting dialogue in the first version, which does translate to the idea in the finished film that Zukovsky wants to kill Electra if she's harmed his nephew. Bond says, "I'm not sure I can allow that," which is an
Yeah.
interesting one. It's far more subtextual in the film, and I prefer the film version because it is. But it shows that idea about whether Bond can allow Electra to die is there from the first film, which is one of my highlights from the film.
I would agree. Yeah, I'd agree.
Then in the first version, the Purvis and Wade version, we have not one, not two, but essentially three action sequences added that never make the final film, which I found was, it's at least two. I found this part of the screenplay quite exhausting. And I
Yeah.
think this is probably why they all got ditched. So the first one is Bond chasing after, I want to say Gabor at this point. So he's chasing. So there's a fight in a bathhouse,
Yeah.
which is sort of You Only Live Twice-ish / View to a Kill. So Christmas escapes and she runs. So she's kidnapped essentially, but she escapes when she runs and Bond takes a crane and basically takes like You Only Live Twice, grabs a car and moves it and plumps it somewhere else. So that's the first sequence. Yeah. Then Bond and Christmas are driving the crane, which immediately recalls in my mind Bond and Stacey in the fire engine of View to a Kill. But also, I think he's probably the antecedent of the idea that Bond getting in a JCB digger in Skyfall in the pre-title sequence. And then this whole sequence, no, hang on, we've got two more. So this whole sequence ends. Oh my God, I'm exhausted just repeating it. He's cornered in a square in the crane. So what Bond does, and this clearly influenced the start of No Time to Die, Bond spins the crane around, and I know Bond isn't in a crane, but he's trapped in a square. And essentially, I know he's donutting the car with the machine guns, but the idea of being trapped in a square and having to spin something around, I know it sounds tangential, but I had No Time to Die running through my head. And then, just to finish off all of these sequences, we have Gabor and Bond fighting, and then Gabor eventually gets electrocuted and by the pantograph. So Gabor and Bond fighting on top of a tram, which is quite similar to the fight on top of a cable car in Moonraker.
Yeah.
Wow. None of that makes the film.
And as you say, isn't it much better for it? Because I always think The World Is Not Enough is quite an action-heavy film anyway, because I know we kind of glossed over, well, we'll get back to it in a minute, but even when they switch around, we get two really big action sequences almost back to back with the pipeline and then the caviar factory. And then, we're coming not long after several others, all the way back from obviously the massive retitles and the snowmobile chase and not sorry, the snow chase with the Parahawks, and it just I think cramming, as you say, not one, not two, but three more in there, like because
Yeah.
this isn't long after the caviar factory in the
No.
pipeline. And it's just like you say, I also felt exhausted reading it. And you think you can't have too much action in that.
Yeah.
You need the breathing as well as the in a Bond film. Or to me, at least, I think you need the quieter bits in between with the
Yeah.
peaks of the action. But as you say, it's interesting that they recycled. I totally agree with you that I think this really came back in Skyfall and also No Time to Die. I think was the two. We haven't had the tram fight though, right? We haven't had anything that's remotely
No,
similar.
we haven't had a
Yeah.
tram. That would make my husband happy. He works in the tram construction industry. So that's why I know what a pantograph is. Yeah, if you were impressed by my tram terminology a couple of minutes ago, that's because of Anthony. Yeah, he would love a tram sequence. We've only had trams in the Living Daylights.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be great to have a tram action sequences. The only problem is, and I wouldn't say this to my husband, trams don't tend to be that fast. You know, if Anthony's listening to this, then sorry, darling, but they might not be the right vehicle for a
I
Bond
must
action
admit
sequence.
that that struck me as well with this particular stage director, which says a vicious fight ensues. The two of them, so that's Bond and Gabor, trading punches while avoiding bridges and even more dangerously the tram's overhead power cable. It's like, oh, how are they going to get away with that bridge? They've got 30 seconds to duck before the tram gets there. So it's not like the Octopussy fight, really, is it? It's
No,
just not quite the same level of
not at
drama.
all.
But
If we go back to the Caviar Factory, then, which in the second and third versions appears now, that's right, isn't it, Tom?
yeah.
There is a lovely segue in the Dana Stevens version to this, and we get a nice segue in the film. You know, there's one thing I overlooked: caviar.
Yeah.
This segue is a call back to when Bond was talking with Christmas about having a champagne with her later. And he says here, I know I promised you champagne, but how about caviar? Cut to Caviar Factory, which I quite liked that bit, to be honest.
Yeah, me too.
And there's also a nice transition in the Bruce Fierstein version where Bond asks Christmas, what's the atomic weight of caviar? And then Christmas starts on, and I love it because she's such a physics geek, probably close to cesium. He seems to have negative buoyancy. That's actually when Zukovsky has fallen into the caviar vat as he's done in the finished film. But it actually allows Christmas to use some scientific concepts. And I can't help thinking Bruce Fierstein must have phoned up a nuclear physicist and said, can you give me what a nuclear physicist would say in this situation? So I'm actually gutted to have lost those lines.
Yeah. I mean, now you mentioned it, I'm not even sure, other than a sort of techno babble in the very first time we see her when she's in the sort of radiation suit, I can't really think of many times Christmas is.
Well, we're going to get to the ending in a minute because she does do techno babble throughout the original climax in all three versions.
That is true.
So just before we get there, Maiden's Tower makes its appearance in the second version, the Dana Stevens version. There are some lovely jokes as well, depending on your point of view, about the appearances of scientists and stereotypical expectations of what a scientist looks like. And that would have probably kind of tried to answer some of the critics of Christmas Jones. And I can't help feeling it would have been sensible to have left some of those in, like the David Stevens version has them.
I would agree, because as I mentioned before, I feel it's quite unfair, I guess, to knock the character, oh, she's too attractive to be a scientist, and well, that's not really true. I see no reason why they can't be. But I suppose maybe they were naively hoping that if they didn't call attention to it, people would notice. Maybe maybe this dialogue makes it too obvious.
Tom, I repeat, three words: hot right now.
See, in it took me a few reads to get what they meant, because in my childlike naivety, I thought, oh, of course she's hot. She just come out of a a radiation suit. She's going to be warm. Oh no, they mean
no,
they
Tom.
don't mean that at all.
No. And then there's also a really nice exchange between Christmas and Bond in the Dana Stevens draft of Christmas says, Commander Bond, you are dangerous, unpredictable, and a hothead. And he just looks at her. Christmas replies, but then again, explosive devices are my speciality. I do want that in the film. It might have tipped it over into self-parody, but I love that bit. And then after the caviar factory, then, and I know we're jumping around a bit, but then we're returning to kind of the structure of the film as it actually appears.
Yeah.
The transition to the climax is essentially by the second draft. Well, actually, Gabor has Christmas hostage. Musty Bullion leaves a briefcase bomb. Well, essentially, the boa in this version, not Mr. Bullion, but of the villain, basically, the henchman leaves a briefcase bomb. Slightly different locations. Eventually, we get to a KGB safe house, which is because the other versions just need really long explanations as to where they are. So in the end, it's just like in the finished film, it's Zukovsky just saying, yes, this is a KGB safe house as they walk through it. So it's very, very quick. It's exposition on the fly in the finished film, because it must be said the Dana Stevens draft was 138 pages. And even the Bruce Fierstein version, which is slightly tighter, is 129 pages. So they must have realized that the film was running long. So some of these things are obviously chopped down. But then we get to the showdown with Elektra, basically my favorite part of the whole film. What I was interested to find is that the dialogue, which again, with my queer lenses on, I can't help but latch onto these things, is that Elektra calling Christmas a pretty thing in reference to Christmas, which is obviously, you know, criticism. It's objectifying her, but also kind of saying, oh, Elektra may also find Christmas appealing, which kind of plays into the whole queer sexuality around Elektra anyway. That's there right from the first draft of Purvis and Wade, which is a great inclusion. We then get tons of detail about what the bomb will do to the Bosphorus to make the pipeline the only one. And I'll be honest, I didn't really understand it. And I think no one else did either. So I think they just thought, no, she's going to destroy Istanbul and it's going to make only one pipeline and that'll be hers, which doesn't go through Istanbul. Done. We don't need all this bonus exposition.
I agree, because like one of those things where I think we can all agree nuclear submarine exploding equals bad.
Pretty deadly, yeah.
You know, we need layers of why it's bad. It's like, I think I think I kind of would mention this right at the very start, but the one thing I think, if I could praise the final film, and the third draft, obviously, because it's the closest to the final film, but also the final film in general, it's for efficiency and expediency. And while we do lose some of these nice bits of dialogue that we mentioned, a lot of character moments and things, we do lose so much of like the flabby exposition that maybe when you're writing a script you feel you need to include because you need to justify this and everything, and then you've done your research and you've read this cool thing. But really, particularly in a Bond film, particularly one like this where, as I say, it's so fast moving with so many action sequences anyway, you don't really need to know about the laser lathe and the why it's going to be bad with this. And we know, we get it. And it definitely, I think, tightening, because you can see from draft 1 to 2 to 3 the dialogue getting progressively tighter and tighter, and stuff being cut. Like certain scenes, like with the banker at the start, there's so much exposition there that it just gets cut down like 2 lines by the final. And it's just it's a real, I think, lesson in sort of script expediency and what you need, and like only just getting the actual details in.
The major difference with the first draft is that Elektra is far less sure of herself in this version. So she even says to Bond at one point, no, James, please, you can't kill me. This wasn't me. He changed me. I think that would have weakened her character. I think she's so committed and she's so self-assured. You can't kill me, not in cold blood, is one of my favorite parts, because you really do think, oh my God, is James Bond going to kill a woman in cold blood? Yeah, and you don't get that here. She doesn't have that surety to her.
Yeah, I mean, I'm literally looking at this bit now, and we get a page. We get a page running between 2, but of dialogue between Bond and Elektra when Bond has her cornered with a gunpoint. This back and forth about, oh, I have to do what Renard tells me. No, James, please, you can't kill me. Then they start talking about Helsinki syndrome, which I'm like,
I've just realized it actually is in the first draft. It's not the second draft, but it's called Helsinki. This is the same thing as Stockholm syndrome.
And I'm thinking of Die Hard, you know, Helsinki, Sweden, and it's like Renard, I like to say, oh, I try to break away from Renard, and Bond has like almost like a monologue about how Renard fell for her and you twisted your own kidnap around. It's just telling us what we already know. It's like literally this like show don't tell thing. It was, you know, like, I think you made the wrong choice, James. You came up to me when you should have gone for the submarine and this, and then he shoots her, and it just feels so much more anticlimactic
Yeah,
than that what we get in the thing where he's, it's one of the only times I can think of where I think we legitimately see Bond angry, like really angry, where he's
yeah.
telling her to stop the submarine. Like you could see he's furious because usually,
Cut him
like I
off.
think, yeah, I think the character Bond's often pretty good at like masking his true
Yeah,
emotions, and it really just comes through. Then it's so much more powerful. I think
I
it's a
agree.
true less is more. Like
The stakes are nowhere near as high in this version.
yeah,
So he's even more cold-blooded because actually killing Elektra doesn't influence the outcome of the
no,
story at all. Whereas actually from the second version onwards, the stakes are much higher because the sub hasn't left yet.
mm,
In the first version, the sub has left, and so it's already on its way. So Bond knows he's got limited time to get to the sub, but he could just get after the sub and just leave Elektra alone.
yeah,
Whereas in the second version onwards, so Dana Stevens adds in the dive Bond bit, which
mm,
is in the film, which I love. It's that that's the thing that pushes Bond over the edge to actually kill her. It's like, no, she's irredeemable. She's
mm.
actually just sent the submarine to kill millions of people with Renard on board. So I much, much prefer the version from Dana Stevens' script onwards than the one we get in the finished film.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the again, it's personal preference, but the line that Bond delivers to Elektra in this first draft before shooting her, which is, "You like to live dangerously, Elektra. Well, this is as dangerous as it gets," and then he shoots her through the heart. It's just so baffling to me and so bizarre. I don't get it. Like, what, you like to live dangerously? Well, I'm going to kill you now for no reason. It's like I don't see, like, why does he kill her in this first draft? Like you
It
said,
doesn't
it's just
make sense.
cold
He
blooded.
doesn't actually
Doesn't
have
make
to
any
kill her at
sense.
all, apart
Doesn't
from
have
he's
to
just
kill her at
really
all.
angry at her.
Yeah,
I mean, we get the "I never miss" line from Dana Stevens onwards as well. We get
yeah,
M
which
watching
is
with Bond,
excellent.
Bond not realizing that M's watching, which is again one of my favorite moments of this
Yeah.
film. So that sequence is like one of my top 5 Bond
Mm.
sequences of all time. And really, I think, again, we keep coming back to it. Dana Stevens really deserves the credit there.
There's one little moment in that Dana Stevens version which I wish they'd kind of had in the actual film, because of course when Bond shoots Elektra, it's very abrupt. She just falls back and she's
Yeah.
dead. But she mentioned this one line where Bond shoots her and it says Elektra staggers back, shocked at her own mortality before she. Like, I would have liked this moment of surprise where she just
Yeah.
didn't think until it happened that he was ever going to shoot her, and then she has this one moment of surprise that
Mm.
would have to be played properly, or you're going to end up with Charles Gray Blofeld with a yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not that, more like maybe go a bit more subtle. I'm sure Sophie Marceau could have handled it. But
And then, of course, we end up on board a submarine. So the dive into the submarine, I think he's there from the start
yeah,
in the first draft, but
yeah,
we get lots more exposition about what's going on in the submarine, courtesy of Christmas. So
yeah.
we actually get numbers. I keep meaning to go back and watch the end of the secret film again, just to
Mm,
see if there are numbers on the dials. I can't remember there being, but there are colors which kind of sell it more. But
yeah,
Christmas actually tells us basically once it gets to 5,000 degrees, there's no
mm,
going back. We're all dead.
yeah.
So, but it takes a long time to explain all of this in the screenplay. And I'm like, oh, thank God they cut all of this out,
Uh,
because I know that some people have an issue with the world is not F ending because you really don't kind of know what is going to save the day. But
mm,
I don't think you do in these script versions either, to be honest. And we do rely on Christmas for the exposition, but it's far more technical in these versions.
mm. Um, I think, isn't there, like, I feel there's like some maybe brief bits of technological explanation that they kind of submerge, pardon the pun, where Christmas and Bond like climbing out of the bunch when she's you know nearly drowning. He opens the thing, and I'm sure she mentions something same
It'll
as you. I
explode
should
but
have went
not go
with
nuclear and all that.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But it's very again, pardon the pun, watered down from what we get in these things where it's just, as I say, a second draft. We've got Chris melting down 4,000 degrees. There's zirconium casings on the rods, crack 5,000 plutonium melts in 10 minutes, an explosion, etc., etc. And it's all like, I agree with you. Like, maybe it's a little nebulous on what will happen,
Yeah.
because I must admit that's a problem. Maybe not from when I was a kid, but like for years I've always thought this is a bit weird that um it's not quite Deus Ex Machina, but it kind of comes out of nowhere that Bond Renard fight. Renard knocks Bond in a thing and seals him in.
Yeah.
It just so happens to be this one thing with the eject button that as far as I'm aware, we haven't seen before. It hasn't been like foreshadowed. It just happens to be in the one place where you can eject the rod, and it's a bit.
Yeah, I don't think it works as well as it should. Even though I love this
Yeah.
film, I don't think that part of the film works as well as it should. I think this film is really good at the emotional stuff works really well, and then the plot
Yeah,
machinations are kind of like, yeah, okay, you just have to go with it, and it's certainly the case here as well. And the thing with Renard, I love that look that Robert Carlyle gives after Bond says, "She's waiting for you,"
yeah,
and it's almost like, oh God, she's messed both of us up, hasn't she? That
yeah.
look that he gives Bond. So I think the emotional payoff works. I don't think the plot payoff works particularly well here. So in a sense, I would have kind of liked to have seen the Numbers of Degrees version where we get all of this exposition just to see if it did make a difference.
I
But
agree.
yeah,
I mean, I do quite like the very ending of the fight in this second draft, the Dana Stevens one. I think it works better because Renard never traps Bond in the little cage area where he ends up. They're still
yeah,
fighting in front of the
yeah, that's
reactor.
not there, is it?
Exactly. And Bond just sees one of the hoses starting to come loose from the
Yeah,
reactor
from the
going
pressure.
off.
Yeah,
Yeah, and he puts it back in and then ducks there because Renard's behind him with a flare gun. He's going to shoot him with a flare gun. And Bond jams this hose back in and then quickly ducks down, and the rod fires out just past his head and then hits Renard standing behind him, which I guess maybe you don't quite have the visual in the same way as you do in the film of it being right there and hitting him at close
yeah,
range. But I do think it maybe makes a little more logical sense.
yeah,
And as you say, I think this is payoff of what maybe works best from a film logic point of view, what works best from an emotional and a
yeah.
visual storytelling point of view. And yeah, it's probably the right call. I think they went with in the end, even though it does bug me a little bit. But I'm
I
nitpicking.
agree. There are some other interesting details here. So the sub starts shaking. I didn't quite understand this, to be honest, but starts shaking and making such a ruckus that actually the people in Istanbul start noticing something weird going on in the Bosphorus.
Yeah.
And so you see the people of Istanbul reacting. I quite like those moments in films where you see the stakes. So you see that all the millions of people, they're not faceless, they're going to die. You can't help do Alan Partridge there. But it's I kind of want those bits in the film because it might raise the stakes, but I understand why they're not there. And also the sub actually surfaces and at the end smashes Electra's temple where her kind of lair was, and then submerges, which is an interesting visual. So we say a submarine lurching out of the ocean, smashing a building.
I'm sure we can read whatever phallic symbolism
Oh God,
of,
don't you start, Tom.
of it smashing her temple. And yes,
Oh my God. Okay,
all.
I didn't even go there. I didn't even want to go there. The other things, I'm just thinking about the other differences here. There is, so after the kind of they've saved the day. It's a classic Bond in a boat ending, and in the Purvis and Wade version, to signal that they need rescuing, Bond takes the boat and carves the wake out in a 007 sign, and I'm like, really? No, I think they might have been too many coffees by this point.
Yeah.
So that's obviously tipping what is actually quite a serious film in some regards into self parody. And then especially as in this version, we'll come back to Christmas in a minute. So right at the end of the first draft, there's a detail which I've always found quite chilling when I've read that script, because I have skim read that script a couple of times. But the last shot of the film is the camera after we've left Bond and Christmas, the camera sweeping past the angular minaret where Electra lies dead. So the very last thought the filmmaker, the Purvis and Wade wanted to leave us with was Electra's dead. Whereas in the film, it's like, let's just, we've got our happy ending now. Bond's got the girl, the princess, all those archetypes have kind of kicked in. Whereas they almost wanted a kind of bittersweet aftertaste in the film originally.
I agree. It's a strange ending, I think, especially when we discuss what it is juxtaposed immediately with.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm not sure how well, because I was just trying to remember, like obviously you won't be able to see this if you're listening to it on the podcast, but I've got the final shot behind me on the video, and I was wondering
Well,
whether
penultimate shot before we go to the
exactly.
bedroom. Yeah, yeah.
And I was wondering whether the Maiden's Tower was in the background, but it isn't. So yeah, that was just totally, because I thought maybe that's the one place they could have slipped that in the back, but no, they just totally discounted the idea. And it is, yeah, it is a bit weird. I think this whole first draft has a bit of an issue with tone overall. I don't know whether you
Yeah.
feel the same way. Like they don't know whether sometimes which way to go. I mean, they're clearly trying to channel certainly Connery. I would say I get some elements of Moore in particularly in Bond's dialogue feels very sometimes like Roger. There's a lot of deers. He throws like deer in when he's talking
Mm,
to Electra. Like I hear that, I think of Roger Moore. Like I don't think Brosnan really talked like that. He didn't have that sort
no.
of way of speaking. But then it's juxtaposed with this really obviously like serious plot line and themes. I mean, even I would say as far as like draft 3, things like Bullion being like a Rwandan genocide. It's like really that character? What Goldie? I don't know.
Yeah.
Just like please to cut that. It's a bit weird. He's a comic relief character, but he's also
Mhm.
like does genocide. I don't know. It just it wasn't. It feels like a bit. I mean, I think the world is not enough is a bit tonally jarring at times anyway. But it's a Brosnan film. It's going to
Well,
be.
you know me, I love tonally jarring
And
films,
I
as,
do
as
too.
we've
I don't think it's
established
fair.
by now. But
I agree.
I think that was the right move not to go back to Electra at
100%.
the end of this film.
100%.
Even though what does actually bring the film to a climax is very wry. So
Uh,
let's just go there, okay?
mm.
So we're on about 2 hours by now, Tom. It's taken probably longer than the film itself to get to this point, but hopefully people listening or watching have found our kind of commentary of the different versions interesting. But we did promise we would end on a high. I'm again choosing words very, very carefully here. So in the first version, they make love and Christmas says to Bond, James, in our hotel room, if you remember, I told you to remember this about an hour ago. So they had sex in Istanbul. So James, in our hotel room, Christmas came early. So that's the first version.
Yeah, doesn't really
Yeah.
work for me.
No. Second version, we do have a "I love Christmas in Turkey" line. Okay, I've always wanted to have Christmas in Turkey, which is what we
Yeah.
get in the finished film, but it is there. It's starting to creep in. Then the second version introduces the Millennium Bug.
Yeah.
And we get the line of dialogue could be a premature form of the Millennium Bug. So this script's obsession with things being premature, actually that was there in the first draft. Dana Stevens adds this premature Millennium Bug line, which we get in the finished film. And Dana Stevens then writes in bed, and it's a Christmas line, not a Bond line, James, I think Christmas is coming early this year. So it's a premature sexual incontinence gag. And then this is the one that actually still it's exactly the same in Bruce Feirstein version. James, I think Christmas is coming early this year. So the version we eventually get in the film, which I think we can all agree is the best version,
Absolutely.
who knows who actually wrote that line?
Yeah, I know when we were briefly talking about this before we started recording, I was speculating, was it maybe Brosnan? Was it somebody on set? Who knows? It could be. I would love to know who came up with it, because I don't know, but I speculate there may have been a shooting draft after this, because there is some minor tweaks to dialogue here and there. So maybe it was Firestein, or maybe they gave it back to Purvis and Wade, and they. I would love to know, because it could be anybody. Like this is the real. We're talking about Dana Stevens. This is the real unsung hero of this film. Is who came up with that line, because it's genius, and it's one of those things where it seems like so obvious in hindsight, but nobody. I was convinced Bruce Feirstein would have done it. Especially,
Yeah. When I read the third version, I thought, right, this is where we get the line from the film, and I was like, no, it's not. It's the same.
The same one, and it just. Like, I know we were talking about it, and just to neither of us, it doesn't really work. It doesn't quite work. Certainly not as well as the other one, but even in isolation, like, I think Christmas is coming early this year. It's like, I don't know. It's all right. But it just
I much prefer the finished film because, in a sense, even though Bond says it, and it would probably be quite nice for Christmas to finish the film, um, you know, and again, this is where I'm choosing my words very carefully. Instead of it being a gag about sexual incontinence, it's more of a gag around, you know, whip female pleasure. There's a whole thing that when I've tackled World Is Not Enough is the only Brosnan film I've not done my in-depth queer review of yet. But I think this will probably be the time when I do it to kind of tie together all the different bits around women's pleasure in the Brosnan era. There's an academic essay. If no one's written that one yet, then someone needs to do women's pleasure in the Brosnan era.
Remember pleasure.
Yeah, remember pleasure, exactly. Because there is that focus right from GoldenEye and Moneypenny's kind of rebuff of Bond, and then you've got the cunning linguist line from Tomorrow Never Dies. You've got the cigar tube here, and it climaxes, intentional choice of words. It climaxes with Moneypenny using the VR goggles, and there's a whole thing around women and solo sexuality and in Brosnan era, which I've kind of tackled in piecemeal. But in a sense, The World Is Not Enough is the glue that holds that idea together, because it ends on a focus on female sexuality. I know I'm going off on one, Tom, but that, you know, that line is just hilarious. But also, I think it reveals a lot around the mindset of the filmmakers in the Brosnan era, and they were trying to put more of an emphasis on female sexuality, and women experience sexual pleasure too. So yes, there are lots of penis jokes, but there are lots of jokes about women's anatomy, and, you know, a recognition that women are sexual creatures just as well as men. And I think, without, you know, over academizing it too much, I think the climax of The World Is Not Enough, the multiple climax of The World Is Not Enough, actually, I think he's probably the boldest statement about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. Like, the only I mentioned it just briefly there. I think Xenia and Goldeneye, I think is quite an interesting one as well, and really, as you very eloquently put there, really shows, I think, in this era of Bond where they were intending on going with female sexuality, because we've never had, as far as I can remember, there's never been like somebody in Bond that uses their sexuality as a weapon other than Bond himself in such a way. I think maybe the closest we get is sort of Dr. Goodhead in Moonraker. You know, there's when she sleeps with Bond in Venice, and there's this sort of illusion that she's using him as much as he thinks he's just being Bond, but actually being. But I think that was maybe more, rather than personally, I think rather than having sort of anything to say on female sexuality, that was more of a look. They're kind of the same thing, being both agents. It's like a similar sort of, they're just playing off it like that. But yeah, I think the Brosnan era is really fascinating, especially when, as you say, the 90s to me was I was thankfully too young to remember much of it, but to me it doesn't seem like much of a enlightened time from sexuality for Lowbridge.
Definitely not. Trust me, I'm about 10 years older than you are. So it was definitely not an enlightened period.
I will audio greater experience, and it's interesting that there is this definite. I mean, as you just pointed with so many examples, and I'm sure if you went and look, there will be more. There will be more than those brief ones that we've mentioned. I let me just stop to think there. Like, is there any character that doesn't fit that mold in the Brosnan? I'm like, not really. I mean, like Miranda Frost again, using sex as a weapon. There's so many examples of
the coldest weapon.
The coldest weapon, yeah. But like you say, that one line is a bit of a Rosetta Stone, I suppose, really, of like unpacking the whole era. And it's absolutely fascinating. And thank God somebody changed it, because we wouldn't be having this discussion if they'd kept it like the same way.
I would love to one day find out who is responsible for that line.
If anybody's listening and knows, tell us. Please, if it was you, get in touch.
Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing us so much pleasure over the years. Yeah, again and again. And I think we probably need to just finish there. Yeah.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, it's like, as you say, it's been like 2 hours, far longer than this always happens though. But still, it was a good thing. We always think we can fit it all in neatly, and there's just so much to talk about with these drafts. They're fascinating. Honestly, we could have probably done another 2 hours easily.
Yeah, we've skimmed over some of the details. So if you are really, really interested, or if we've piqued your interest, it's definitely worth reading at least the first two. I think the third one is not as radically different, but you can see some of the best lines actually do appear dialogue-wise. I think Bruce Feirstein, that was why he was often brought on, to kind of punch up the
I think
dialogue,
he had
particularly Bond's dialogue. And you can see those differences there. But definitely, it's really interesting reading the first and the second versions. How freely available are these scripts if people want to get hold of them themselves, Tom?
They're floating around. I mean, I may well put a link up on Twitter to them, because unlike some of the other ones, like the Mayban ones, these seem to be which are like academic things you really got to request. These seem to be more freely available. I know I've seen them pop up linked on Twitter now and then. I think the Bond writing Twitter account, which has some really good anecdotes. Their pinned tweet has a Google Drive with I think it's got at least 2 of these in there. I don't know if it's got all 3, but I'll probably link to them, because it's well worth anybody investing.
I believe, unlike some of the earlier scripts which we've talked about on earlier podcasts together, where you've had to essentially call for them specifically from people's archives. As an academic, I think most of these are freely available because they're for use for educational purposes, which is the get out. Although I'm not quite sure what lessons we should be learning from reading these scripts. I mean, it is interesting though. As I know you're a scholar. And I do it part-time when I'm not doing the day job, but it is interesting, I think, just if you're a Bond fan and you're at all interested into how a script generates from one version to another and how those ideas progress. And I think it's really, really interesting to read these.
Yeah, because I think particularly when people delve into things like auteur theory and that sort of thing, I think we can sometimes lose sight of just how collaborative a medium filmmaking is. Because
yes,
obviously it depends film to film, but on something like a Bond film, as we've demonstrated from this, even something like the writing is like a 4-person job often. It's not just one person. Even the ones that people say, oh, the Purvis and Wade scripts in the Craig era, and I mean, even that's 2 people, writing as a duo. Even that, we've got a whole host of other people came in and did rewrites. John Logan, of course, did a couple of them, and
Paul Haggis.
Paul Haggis, exactly. And so it's not just one person's ideas that these things come from. It's a whole, and even people like we've mentioned before, Michael G. Wilson and people bring ideas from all over. And I think reading through these really demonstrates that, and you can see what each person added to the development of the film, and it really I think helps to just give things more of a polish and give a fresh set of eyes to look at something, a Bond script, because often it's not. Obviously, some films are so very personal, and it's something somebody wants to write about. And often, I think that can really benefit from just being one person's thing. A Bond script, I think, which just obviously so many things to so many different people, I think it could really benefit from getting a lot of people to look at it.
I agree. And it is no criticism of any particular director. I know certain writers come in for more criticism, but it genuinely shows the power of collaboration here.
I agree.
That, the finished film that we got, and it is one of my favorite Bond films, The World Is Not Enough. The finished film we got was clearly, the influence of at least 4 people, 3 of whom are credited on the film, plus Michael Wilson, plus, things that happen on the sets. And everything else, really. So these scripts are a really great testament to that, I think.
I agree, and is this 3 for 3 that I think we both agree that the finished film was probably the best iteration of what we got.
100%.
Well, with all 3, with the diamonds inspired me, there's certainly moments I think we both, and there's certainly moments I think we both said, oh, I would have loved that would be in there, loved that would be in there. But I think overall, I wouldn't be like, oh, I wished I'd seen that version over what we got. If it was an either or, I'd rather have what we got. I don't know if that's maybe just because it's the luxury of a finished product, but it does feel, more of a polished thing, like rather than some of these which have got the positives and the negatives.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And on that note, I finished my drink. So
Mine's long gone. I
I
finished
was
the
going to say,
caviar factory.
I didn't expect us to be still going, after 2 hours. So thank you for listening, watching along, folks. We need to choose our next film now that we're going to do this for. So I know you've got some ideas, but I think
do.
we'll. This script, are you going to reveal now, or are we going to tease?
No, I'll tell you. The next film is
Which
going
one
to
are we
be
doing?
it's going to be How I Left My Shadow-Handed Dr. Blofeld for Spectre's return in Casino Royale during the Airwolf missions.
And if you're wondering whether Tom has finally lost it or if the martini has gone to his head, that's the Dana Stevens ending to her script.
Yeah.
So yes, the end, but James Bond will return in, and then there's all these references to Bond and non-Bond things stuck into one sentence. It's very strange.
They were making Shadowhand jokes 20 years ago, apparently.
I know.
Long before people were speculating about No Time to Die's title or speculating.
Maybe that was the reason she got her name taken off the film. Because it's just like, you're not taking this remotely. No, of course it wasn't. Yeah.
No, there's a few I've got in mind. I know I don't like tie anything down. I know we floated the idea of possibly doing one of these as like a live stream or something sometime. Maybe might make the free flow discussion a bit more understandable if people were, maybe if we just work with one and people say something that they might like to know, we can bounce things off. But
yeah, that would be a good idea.
It would be a good idea. Of course, it depends whether anybody cares, so let us know if that's sort of thing. If you made it this far, congrats. If from our ramblings.
This is by far the longest one of these that we've done. Yeah. So but no, just so many interesting things. So yeah, if you do want us to do a film in particular, I know Tom and I have bounced around a couple of ones that we'd love to tackle. So far we've done one Connery, we've done a obviously today we've done Brosnan, we've done a Roger Moore. So maybe we have a look at one from another Bond if we can get hold of materials.
I mean, Majesty's is interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave there. Otherwise, we're going to slip into spoiler territory. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much
for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, definitely go back there. As I say, they're some of the most popular episodes we've ever put out. So thanks very much.